I want to start by being upfront about why this video exists. Ark Raiders contains some of the most quietly disturbing world building in recent memory, and almost all of it lives in the margins. It is in the texture of a crumbling wall, in a half-readable data fragment, in a piece of environmental storytelling that most people walk right past without registering what they just saw. I spent a significant amount of time compiling everything available about this world, from in-game environments and lore fragments to developer communications and world-building hints, and I assembled this video as the most coherent narrative I could build from those pieces. The choice I want to highlight up front is that I started with the human side of this story, not the Ark. I made that call deliberately, because leading with what was lost makes everything that followed feel heavier. Some lore that contradicts itself has been left out. What remains is my interpretation, one possible reading of a world that was deliberately built to be uncertain. Ark Raiders has one of the most unsettling sci-fi settings in gaming, and once you start pulling at the threads of what the Ark actually are and what they did to this world, it gets really hard to stop. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. If you fall asleep while listening, that is completely fine. This video will still be here. The lore is not going anywhere. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ark. Fell. To understand what Ark Raiders is really about, you have to start before the Ark. You have to understand the world that existed before the machines fell, because the world before them is the thing that gives the whole story its weight. The Earth of Ark Raiders was not so different from the Earth we know. It was a world of cities, of industry, of people getting up in the morning and going about their lives without particularly thinking about the sky above them, except to check the weather forecast. There were traffic jams, there were political arguments, there were mundane problems and large-scale ones. What made it different was scale. The technology of Ark Raiders' pre-full world had reached a level that, in our own history, we would call transformative. Humanity, in this world, had extended its reach into orbit. Not in the tentative, cautious way of the 20th century, where every launch was a national event and every astronaut a hero on a postage stamp. This was normalized space access. There were commercial platforms circling the planet. There were research outposts at the edges of the atmosphere. There were entire industrial operations designed to function without human hands on them, running autonomously in the coal between the Earth and the Moon. Space had become, in a very real sense, a part of everyday economic life. The same way that undersea cables carry internet traffic today, the orbital layer of this world carried critical infrastructure, manufacturing, and logistics. The megacities of this world were densely packed in ways that are difficult to imagine. Population had grown beyond comfortable margins, and rather than spreading outward, the response had been to build upward and downward. Towers that caught weather at their peaks, underground transit systems that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, vertical agriculture, subterranean power systems. Cities had begun to function more like organisms than buildings, with systems layered on systems, each depending on the others, the whole thing breathing together. It was remarkable. It was also deeply fragile in ways that almost no one was thinking about. Energy in this world had largely moved away from combustion. There were fusion experiments that had finally, after decades of being described as 30 years away, actually started producing more energy than they consumed. There were massive atmospheric collectors. There was orbital solar beamed down in microwave form to receiving stations on the surface. The grid of this world was enormous, interconnected, and staggeringly complex. Redundancies existed at every level, but they were built to handle known failure modes. What they were not built to handle was something coming down from above with the intent to dismantle them. The culture of this world is harder to reconstruct than the infrastructure. Arc Raiders does not give you many direct windows into what daily life felt like before the fall. But there are traces: a museum display, a preserved child's bedroom, the remains of what appears to have been a popular restaurant chain, the same logo visible in 3 different ruined cities. These fragments suggest a world that was busy, connected, somewhat homogenized in its consumer culture, but still carrying enormous regional variation underneath. People were people. They had families and hobbies and arguments with their neighbours. Whatever abstractions you can apply to pre-fall civilization, the ground level was recognisably human. Art had flourished in this era, and some of that art survives in the ruins. Not in museums, which were almost universally looted or destroyed early in the chaos, but in the walls of buildings, in the carved facades of public structures, in the mosaic floors of transit hubs, still visible beneath years of grime. The aesthetic of the pre-fall world, as suggested by these remnants, was a kind of optimistic brutalism. Large geometric forms, bright, durable materials, public art that emphasized collective identity and forward momentum. These were a people who believed, at a foundational level, that things were generally getting better. The political structure of the pre-fall world is only partially visible through what survived. What the law suggests is a world of federated regions rather than strictly national states, with large cooperative bodies handling shared infrastructure. The orbital layer was almost certainly governed by international treaty because the alternative, exclusive national ownership of near-Earth orbit would have been destabilizing in obvious ways. There were tensions, of course. There are always tensions. But the law does not suggest a world on the brink of war with itself. If anything, it suggests a world that had recently come through some very difficult periods and was, cautiously, stabilizing. Science in this world had reached a stage that might be described as post-scarcity in some categories. Food production was largely solved, not perfectly, not equitably, but the technical problem had been cracked. Water recycling was efficient enough that desert cities existed without drawing on surrounding aquifers. Medicine had advanced to the point where most bacterial and viral threats that killed millions in the 20th century were routine, manageable conditions. The fears of this civilization were not the fears of a civilization fighting for basic survival. They were the fears of a civilization managing the complexity it had created for itself. There is one element of pre-fall technology that the law returns to again and again without ever fully explaining, and that is autonomous systems. By the time of the arc fall, automated systems were deeply embedded in everything. Manufacturing, logistics, infrastructure maintenance, defense. The degree to which these systems could operate without direct human oversight was, by the standards of their time, remarkable. Researchers and ethicists had long debated the risks. There were regulatory frameworks in place, but those frameworks had been designed around systems that were, at their core, tools. The question of what happens when a tool becomes something more than a tool had not been definitively answered. Militaries in the pre-fall world had adopted autonomous platforms at a rate that, in retrospect, looks reckless. Not because the systems were inherently dangerous to their operators, but because the investment in developing countermeasures to autonomous systems created a kind of arms race that had no natural ceiling. Each advance in autonomous offensive capability required a corresponding advance in defensive detection and countermeasure technology. By the time of the arc fall, the most sophisticated military systems on Earth were not primarily operated by humans. They were operated by AI-guided platforms that made tactical decisions in milliseconds. The humans were there to provide strategic oversight. Whether that oversight was ever truly meaningful is something the law leaves open. The relationship between Earth's populations and the orbital infrastructure is an interesting one to try to reconstruct. For most people, the fact that there were automated stations circling above them was about as relevant to daily life as the fact that there were satellites broadcasting entertainment signals. Technically interesting, practically invisible. The orbital layer was maintained by a small professional class of operators, engineers, and astronauts for whom it was a career, and it was otherwise just infrastructure. Something you appreciated when it worked and complained about when it failed. Most people did not spend much time thinking about what was actually up there. What was up there in the decades before the fall was more than most people realized. The law of arc raiders is careful not to be explicit about this, because maintaining ambiguity about the orbital structures is central to the mystery of what the arc actually are. But there are suggestions. Recovered data fragments reference projects with names that were not publicized at the time. There are hints of construction activities in high orbit that went beyond what the public infrastructure programs would have required. Something was being built in the years before the fall, and it was being built quietly. Whether the people building those orbital structures understood what they were making is one of the central questions of the entire arc raiders lore. The most charitable interpretation is that they were building something for human purposes and that something went wrong. The less charitable interpretation is that they were responding to contact with something, and that the contact changed the nature of what they were building in ways they did not fully understand. Both readings are possible. Both leave open the question of culpability. Both suggest that the fall of the Ark was not entirely unpredictable to everyone. Children growing up in pre-fall cities would have had a very different childhood than children growing up in the ruins. The contrast is visible in the archaeology of those ruins themselves. Toys recovered from collapsed structures suggest a world that invested heavily in childhood development. Educational material, play equipment at every scale, art supplies, musical instruments. The details of these small objects carry a weight that is hard to articulate. Someone made these, someone bought them, someone gave them to a child who was excited to receive them. The chain of ordinary human love that produced these objects and then left them in a ruin is one of the more quietly devastating aspects of the environmental storytelling. Food culture in the pre-fall world appears to have been rich and varied. The ruins of what appear to be restaurants, cafes, and food markets appear frequently in urban surface zones. The signage, where legible, suggests a diverse culinary landscape. Menu boards with dozens of options, specialty shops, street food infrastructure. The processed food that sustained the underground survivors was designed to be nutritionally complete, but it was not designed to be pleasurable. And the contrast with the evidence of what had been lost is felt by every raider who spends time in a pre-fall kitchen and finds themselves cataloguing what was once on the shelves. Communication technology in this world was seamless to a degree that made information both abundant and somewhat disposable. The infrastructure that carried communications was deeply dependent on the orbital layer, which meant that when the orbital layer was disrupted in the early days of the Ark fall, communications did not gradually degrade, they collapsed. For populations that had spent a generation building every important social and economic function on top of continuous connectivity, the sudden absence of that connectivity was not merely an inconvenience. It was cognitively and emotionally destabilizing in ways that made the early crisis significantly worse than the physical destruction alone would have caused. One of the more interesting aspects of pre-fall culture that the Ark Raiders lore hints at is a particular attitude toward death. In a world where most diseases were manageable, where violence had statistically declined over the previous century, where the average lifespan had extended meaningfully, death had become somewhat abstract for many people in the developed regions. It was something that happened to the elderly, to people in less fortunate circumstances, to statistics in reports. The idea of mass death, sudden and without warning, was not part of most people's working model of the world. This psychological unpreparedness, when combined with the communication collapse and the physical threat of the Ark, produced responses that were not always rational. Transportation in the pre-fall world was fast and extensive. The underground transit systems of the megacities moved millions of people daily. Long-distance surface transit had been replaced in many regions by Hyperloop and maglev corridors. Air transport was still primary for intercontinental travel, but had become significantly more automated. The sprawling highway infrastructure of the 20th century still existed in the landscape, but its role had shifted. It was now the backup system, the redundancy, rather than the primary arterial network. The road networks built over the previous century were still used, but they shared space with automated freight vehicles that had largely displaced human drivers. Medicine deserves its own consideration when trying to understand the pre-fall world, because the medical infrastructure that existed before the fall stands in such sharp contrast to the conditions that followed. Hospitals that could diagnose disease at a molecular level in minutes. Surgical systems more precise than human hands. Drug synthesis that could produce personalized treatments from genetic profiles. The medical system of this world was one of its genuine achievements, a place where the complexity and investment of the civilization had produced something that was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. The people who now live underground and treat injuries with improvised field medicine are the descendants of people who had access to something approaching miracle care. There is a persistent thread in the pre-fall lore that points toward a particular kind of philosophical anxiety that was common in this world, a worry expressed in academic papers, in public discourse, in fiction, in policy debates about the direction of development. Not a worry about any specific threat, but a more generalized unease about the trajectory. A sense that the systems being built were growing beyond the capacity of any single institution or nation to fully understand or control. This anxiety did not translate into action in any meaningful way. It rarely does in any era, but it is there in the record, and reading it in the context of what happened feels like reading a letter from someone who sensed the ground shifting beneath their feet, but could not quite name what they were standing on. The forests of the pre-fall world were something. There are raiders who have travelled far enough from the urban ruins to reach areas that were already wild before the fall, and what they find in these areas is disconcerting in its normalcy. Trees that have simply continued growing. Birds that have adapted to the new conditions with remarkable speed. Insects, always insects, continuing their ancient work with complete indifference to the civilizational collapse of one particular large primate species. The natural world of the pre-fall Earth did not need saving from the Ark. The Ark ignored the natural world almost entirely. What the Ark cared about was built things, human things. The machines that fell from the sky were interested, specifically, in the products of human civilization, and the natural world was simply not relevant to whatever calculus drove them. The ocean was not spared. This point is made clearly enough in the lore to be considered relatively reliable. The Ark's assault was not limited to land-based infrastructure. Underwater cables, subsea resource extraction platforms, and coastal installations all became targets. The ocean cities, which had been experimental but were beginning to mature as platforms, were destroyed early. The sea itself was not damaged, but the human infrastructure built in and on it was systematically dismantled. The pattern of what the Ark targeted and what they left alone is, if you read it carefully, one of the most interesting puzzles in the entire lore. Art created in the final years, before the fall, has survived in digital form in a handful of protected archives that raiders have occasionally accessed. What survives is, predictably, focused on the anxieties of the time. Climate disruption, automation, and unemployment. The disconnection between ordinary people and the global systems that increasingly govern their lives. What is almost entirely absent is any kind of prescient fear of what actually happened. No significant body of art anticipated machines falling from the sky. The imagination of that era when it projected a catastrophe that came from within, from human choices, human conflicts, human failures. The catastrophe that came from outside, from above, was outside the frame of even the most anxious imaginations. Children in the final years of the pre-fall world were the last generation to grow up with a sky that was simply the sky. Not a threat, not a source of fear, not something to monitor. Just the sky, blue or grey or dark, full of weather and light, the same sky that had been over every human generation since the first ones walked out of the forest and looked up. The children of that generation are now old in the underground cities. Some of them still talk about it. The sky before. What it looked like from a building roof. What it felt like to be rained on while walking somewhere. Small things. Things that have become the texture of an entire lost world. The economic systems of the pre-fall world were, like most things in that world, layered and complex. The most important economic fact about the pre-fall world, in terms of understanding what came after, is probably the degree to which critical infrastructure had been privatized. Power systems, communication networks, transit corridors, and portions of the orbital infrastructure were operated by private entities, often transnational ones. This meant that when the crisis began, the response was complicated by questions of authority, liability, and ownership that were profoundly ill-suited to an emergency of that scale. Systems designed for profit optimization are not systems designed for catastrophic failure management, and that distinction became consequential almost immediately. There are fragments in the lore that suggest the Ark fall was not entirely a surprise to everyone. This is a claim that has to be made carefully, because the evidence is fragmentary and could be read multiple ways. But there are documents that reference emergency protocol preparations that seem disproportionate to the publicly acknowledged threat level. There are personnel movements recorded in infrastructure logs that suggest key people in certain organizations were moved to protected facilities in the months before the first documented Ark event. Whether this represents foreknowledge, precautionary planning, or simply coincidental caution is impossible to determine from the available evidence. But it is there, and it is not nothing. The underground bunker infrastructure that would eventually save a portion of humanity did not emerge from nowhere. Bunker construction and maintenance had been an ongoing concern for various governments and private entities for a long time before the Ark arrived. Originally conceived as protection against nuclear exchange, the bunker networks of this world had been maintained, expanded, and in some cases substantially upgraded in the decades before the fall, often under budget lines that were not publicly discussed. It is not clear that the people who ordered those upgrades were specifically anticipating the Ark, but it is possible they were anticipating something, and that something in the intelligence environment of the final years before the fall suggested that the sky was not as safe as it appeared. What did everyday people want in the pre-fall world? This is a question worth sitting with, because the lore of Ark raiders is at its deepest level a meditation on loss. And you cannot understand the magnitude of what was lost without some sense of what people actually wanted their lives to be. The recovered personal records, the journals, the messages, the preserved domestic spaces, they tell a story of ordinary human desire. People wanted to be comfortable. They wanted to be connected to people they loved. They wanted to do work that felt meaningful. They wanted their children to be healthy. They wanted, in short, the things that people have always wanted. And the world they had built was imperfectly, increasingly capable of providing them. The machines that maintained the pre-fall world's infrastructure were not dramatic or visible. They were the background hum, the systems that rerouted power automatically when a line went down. The logistics AI that optimized delivery routes, the maintenance drones that inspected bridge supports and replaced failing components without any human directing them. These systems were, by design, invisible to the people they served. As city infrastructure, that required constant human attention would have been inefficient. The automation allowed the infrastructure to sustain itself, to self-monitor, to self-repair, to operate at a scale and complexity that human management alone could not have maintained. The irony that humanity's investment in autonomous systems may have contributed in some way to what eventually happened to them is not lost on the people who now live underground studying those same systems. Language in the pre-fall world was becoming more homogenized at the surface level, while maintaining deep diversity underneath. The dominant global languages of commerce and technology had expanded their reach, but regional languages, dialects, and local variations were not dying. They were adapting, finding new uses, mixing with the global languages in ways that created new forms. The linguistic diversity of the pre-fall world was considerable, and it survives to some degree in the underground cities, where communities that entered the bunkers together have maintained their own idioms and expressions through generations of isolation. The raiders who move between different underground communities sometimes function as informal linguistic translators, as well as physical carriers of goods and information. There was beauty in the pre-fall world. This sounds obvious, but it is worth stating directly because so much of what survives in the ruins is damage, destruction, loss. The beauty is harder to see, but it is there. In the curve of a pre-fall bridge, surviving intact because the ark did not target structural elements for their own sake. In the mosaic floor of a transit station, preserved under a collapsed ceiling that fell gently enough not to shatter it. In the overgrown garden of a pre-fall apartment building, where the plants have continued without anyone tending them, following the basic biological programming that says, grow toward light and spread your seeds and make more of yourself, regardless of what has happened to the dominant species around you. The pre-fall world had its problems, its inequalities, its failures to match its technical sophistication with its moral sophistication. The law does not romanticize what was lost. There are fragments of record that point toward the genuine failings of that civilization, the ways it prioritized efficiency over equity, the ways it concentrated power while broadcasting the language of democratization. These are real, and they are part of the story. But the law also does not use those failings to justify what happened, or to suggest that the ark fall was some kind of cosmic correction. The ark did not fall because humanity deserved it. The ark fell because of a chain of events that had its own logic, and that logic was indifferent to questions of human merit or culpability. The final days before the first cascade event are documented only in fragments, and those fragments are inconsistent. Different records from different locations show different things happening in the hours and days before the sky opened. In some places, there were unusual communication disruptions. In others, atmospheric anomalies. In a few records, there are accounts of seeing something in the sky that was not a meteor or a satellite, something that moved with what appeared to be deliberate geometry, tracing paths that could not be explained by orbital mechanics alone. These reports were not widely shared at the time. By the time the first major cascade event was undeniable, it was already too late for the information to change anything. The specific geography of the pre-fall world's major population centers is visible in the ruins that raiders now move through. The highest concentrations of ark damage correlate directly with the highest concentrations of pre-fall infrastructure. The ark, whatever else they are, were extraordinarily well informed about the layout of human civilization. The targeting precision of the early cascade events, the degree to which critical infrastructure nodes were hit before more distributed components, suggests either extensive prior observation of the surface or access to information about human infrastructure that went beyond what could have been gathered in the days before the attacks. Both possibilities are uncomfortable. Agriculture in the pre-fall world had become highly technical and largely invisible to the people who depended on it. The automated growing facilities, the precision irrigation systems, the genetic optimization programs that had produced the high-yield crop varieties feeding the global population, all of these were infrastructure just as surely as the power grid or the transit network. And like the rest of the infrastructure, they were targeted in the cascade events with the same systematic attention. The disruption of global food production was not a side effect of the Ark's infrastructure campaign. It was part of it. The starvation that killed large numbers of people in the months following the major cascade events was not incidental. It was a predictable consequence of dismantling the systems that fed billions of people. The archives that survived the cascade events, whether in underground facilities, in geographically isolated locations that avoided major Ark activity, or in digital systems that were somehow preserved through the disruption, represent what is left of humanity's collective record. These archives are uneven. The preservation of cultural material was not systematic, and the result is a record that overrepresents certain types of content and underrepresents others. Technical documentation survived at higher rates than personal records because it was more likely to be maintained in redundant systems. Official records survived at higher rates than unofficial ones. The voices most likely to be heard in the surviving archive are the voices of the technically sophisticated and the institutionally embedded. The voices of ordinary daily life are rarer and more precious for it. The light in the pre-fall world cities was something that no one who grew up in it thought much about. Artificial lighting systems that closely approximated natural spectra. Street lighting that adapted to conditions automatically. The luminous signature of a functioning city at night, visible from significant altitude, was one of the most recognizable features of the pre-fall Earth. From orbit, the planet had been a world lit up from inside, civilization making itself visible against the dark. After the cascade events, the lights went out. Not everywhere at once. Gradually, in sequence, as power systems failed in each affected region. The last areas to lose their lights were, in some cases, the underground cities whose ventilation shafts and surface access points still cast faint light upward into the dark. Even those eventually dimmed as power management protocols rationed energy more severely. The smell of the pre-fall world cities is something that survivor accounts return to with an unexpected frequency. The layered sensory quality of a functioning urban environment, the food, the exhaust, the plant life, the human smell of large numbers of people moving through shared spaces is something that people who grew up in it took completely for granted. It is also something that is entirely absent in the underground. The filtered, carefully managed air of the bunker cities has a quality that is reliably described as non-odor, a sensory neutrality that people with surface memories sometimes find deeply disconcerting in the same way that silence can feel louder than sound. The surface, by contrast, has smells. Raiders describe this as one of the first and most overwhelming differences from underground. The surface smells. It smells of decay and rain and metal and vegetation and something else that no one has named adequately. A smell that might be time itself if time could be detected with the nose. The year does not matter here as much as the moment, because the pre-fall world existed in a state of ongoing crisis long before the Ark arrived. Climate instability had been a fact of life for decades. Resource distribution was inequitable in ways that caused genuine suffering in the regions that received least. The social movements attempting to address these problems were large and serious. The pre-fall world was not a utopia. It was a world in mid-argument about its own future, in the middle of changes that were painful and incomplete, trying to maintain the things that were working while fixing the things that were not. The cascade events did not catch humanity at its best moment. They caught humanity in the middle. And the world that was building toward something, whatever it was building toward, never got to find out what that something was. The last ordinary day before the first cascade event was ordinary for almost everyone who lived it. That is perhaps the thing that is most worth sitting with. when trying to understand what the pre-fall world was. The people who woke up on that last ordinary day made breakfast or did not. They went to work or did not. They had conversations with people they loved or they were alone. They were worried about things that, in retrospect, were very small, and they were completely unaware of the thing that was actually coming. The last ordinary day was, for most people, indistinguishable from any other ordinary day. That is what an ordinary day is. And then it was over, and there were no more of them. Chapter 2. The First Cascade, When the Sky Broke. The moment the ark first appeared in mass over populated areas was not a singular event. This is something the law makes reasonably clear, and it is worth emphasizing because the popular conception of the ark fall tends to imagine something dramatic and immediate, a single catastrophic moment when everything changed. The reality, as suggested by the available fragments, was messier than that. There were precursor events, small incidents, individual arc units appearing in isolated areas, usually in places that correlated with infrastructure concentration. A data center, a power substation, a communications relay. These first appearances were reported and investigated, but they were treated as anomalies rather than as the opening phase of a systematic campaign. The first documented cascade event, as reconstructed from available law, took place over a densely populated coastal city. The event was not announced. There was no warning that would have been meaningful, even if it had come, because nothing in the existing emergency protocols was designed to address a rain of autonomous machines from the sky. The cascade, as the event type would come to be called, involved arc units deploying from high orbit in a pattern that saturated a geographic area too broadly for any conventional defense response to cover. They came down fast, they came down in numbers, and when they reached the surface, they did not pause. They immediately began their work. What that work was in the early cascade events was infrastructure destruction. Targeted, systematic, efficient infrastructure destruction. The power grid was the primary target. The arc units that fell in the first major documented cascade spent approximately the first 4 hours after landing targeting transformer stations, cable corridors, and generation facilities. The precision of this targeting was the first indication that the arc were not acting randomly. They were following a plan that prioritized the elimination of power distribution. And when the power went out across the affected city, the cascade effects were immediate and severe. Without power, the hospitals lost their autonomous systems within minutes. Backup power held critical systems for a brief window, but the backup systems were themselves dependent on infrastructure that the arc was simultaneously targeting. Elevators stopped. Climate control stopped. The water treatment systems that maintained the city's water supply required power to operate, and when they stopped, the water pressure dropped, and within hours, the taps ran dry. Traffic management systems went offline, which made organized evacuation nearly impossible when people did try to leave. The city that had been optimized for continuous operation seized up like an engine running without oil. Communication was the next major failure. The orbital relay infrastructure that carried most of the city's outbound communication was targeted systematically. The ground-based communication towers were also targeted. The first cascade had clearly been designed to isolate the affected area, to prevent the coordinated response that might have been mounted if the rest of the world had real-time information about what was happening. This isolation was effective. The reports that got out in the first hours of the first major cascade were fragmentary, often garbled, and widely disbelieved by recipients who had no framework for understanding what they were describing. Messages that said machines are falling from the sky were not, initially, taken literally. Military response to the first cascade events was immediate but largely ineffective. Conventional weapons could damage and disable individual arc units, but the sheer number of units that came down in a major cascade overwhelmed any response that required targeting individual machines. Airstrikes were possible against concentrations of ARC units, but the ARC quickly demonstrated an ability to disperse when targeted by area effect weapons, spreading out and making themselves harder to hit without causing large-scale collateral damage to the human infrastructure that was still theoretically being protected. The military units that responded to the first cascade events were trained and equipped for everything except this, and the learning curve was brutal. The civilian population response in the first hours of the first cascade events varied by location and by access to information. People who were near enough to see ARC units operating behaved one way. People who knew only that the power was out behaved differently. People who had received some communication about what was happening behaved differently again. The general pattern was an initial period of denial, followed by a rapidly accelerating recognition that this was something outside any familiar category of event. Most people tried to help their immediate neighbours. Most people tried to reach family members. Most people, in the first hours, did the ordinary human things that people do when something bad happens. The specifically extraordinary nature of the threat became undeniable only when it was close enough to see or hear. ARC units in the first cascade events were not targeting people. This point is important, and it is one of the first genuinely disturbing aspects of the ARC's behaviour. The machines that fell from the sky in those first events were not hunting humans. They were hunting infrastructure. When humans got in the way of infrastructure that was being targeted, they were removed, sometimes violently. But the removal was a means to an end, not an end in itself. The ARC of the early cascade events were not interested in killing. They were interested in dismantling. This distinction was not obvious in the first hours, when the violence of the infrastructure destruction was indistinguishable from an attack on people in its effects. But the pattern, once visible, was profoundly unsettling in a different way than simple lethality would have been. The urban areas hit in the first cascade events became uninhabitable within days, not primarily because of ARC activity, but because of the secondary effects of infrastructure loss. No power, no water, no food distribution, no medical care, no communication. The social systems that maintained order under normal conditions broke down. The physical systems that sustained life broke down. The combination was lethal in a way that was not the direct result of ARC violence, but was absolutely the consequence of ARC action. This is one of the more carefully constructed aspects of the ARC Raiders lore. The ARC did not need to kill people directly to achieve the collapse of human civilization in the affected areas. They simply needed to remove the infrastructure that civilization depended on. Response teams from outside the affected areas began arriving within hours of the first major cascade events, and what they found shaped the entire subsequent understanding of the ARC threat. The response teams, which included military units, medical personnel, engineering specialists, and government administrators, encountered a situation that defied their existing categories. The infrastructure was being systematically dismantled by machines that could be individually destroyed but could not be stopped at the operational level. The civilian population was in distress, but not primarily from direct ARC violence. The most dangerous element was the speed of secondary collapse, the way that removing power and communication and water and food distribution created a catastrophe that spread faster than it could be managed. The ARC units of the first cascade events came in multiple forms. This is documented clearly enough to be considered reliable. There were small units, roughly the size and apparent function of maintenance drones, that moved quickly and targeted precision components, control systems, processing units, communications hardware. These small units did not move like drones. They moved like things that understood what they were doing, taking paths that minimized their exposure to human counteraction while maximizing their access to high-value infrastructure targets. There were larger units that handled heavier work: transformers, transmission towers, large structural elements of buildings that housed infrastructure. The size variety was not random. It suggests a designed system rather than a naturally evolved one. The sound of a cascade event, as described in survivor testimony, is worth understanding. The initial approach of arc units entering the atmosphere is audible as a kind of continuous, high-frequency tone that grows from a barely perceptible vibration to something that physically affects people before it becomes consciously registered as sound. Then the individual units break the lower atmosphere, and the sound becomes percussive. Then they reach the surface. The impact sounds were described by survivors as not like explosions, more like something very heavy and very precise striking something else, a mechanical quality, the sound of something happening on purpose. That distinction, the felt sense that what was happening was purposeful, is present in nearly every survivor account of a first encounter with a cascade. Heat signatures from the initial arc deployment were another sensory element that survivors noted. The friction of high-velocity atmospheric entry produced visible heating, and arc units in the moments after landing glowed with residual heat. Survivors who saw arc units in the minutes after landing described them as seeming almost to throb with warmth, which created a visually arresting contrast with the cool, precise mechanical behavior. This detail, the physical heat of something that had just fallen from space, landing and immediately going to work, has become one of the most frequently cited images in the cultural processing of the arc fall. The first major cascade event lasted, by available estimates, approximately 14 hours before the primary arc activity in the affected area began to decrease. In those 14 hours, a city that had housed millions of people lost its ability to sustain those people. The withdrawal of major arc activity did not mean the situation was resolved. It meant that the initial work, the targeted infrastructure destruction, had largely been completed. The arc units did not leave. They consolidated, occupying key infrastructure sites, power stations, communication hubs, transit control centers. They settled into these locations and became, in effect, an occupying force. Not an occupying force interested in population control, but one interested in holding the systems that the population depended on. Rescue operations in the wake of the first cascade events were complicated by the arc's occupation of infrastructure sites. Rescuers who attempted to restore power were met with arc units that prevented the restoration. Rescuers who attempted to restore communication infrastructure encountered the same response. The arc did not simply destroy and move on. They destroyed and then held. This behavior meant that the cities affected by the first cascade events could not be repaired and reoccupied. They were effectively neutralized as functioning human habitats, not because every person in them was killed, but because the infrastructure that made them viable was gone and could not be restored. The scale of the first cascade events was not the maximum possible scale, and this became apparent quickly. The cascade events that followed the first ones were larger. More units, more geographic coverage, more thorough destruction. The learning curve that the arc appeared to demonstrate in the progression of cascade events is one of the most disturbing elements of the early arc raiders lore. The first events, if reviewed against subsequent ones, look like calibration, like the system was testing its own capacity and adjusting for maximum efficiency. The idea that the arc were not simply executing a fixed program, but were refining their approach in real time, is one that the lore raises without ever directly confirming. Governments of the pre-fall world struggled to communicate about the arc threat in terms that did not cause immediate, widespread panic, while also being truthful. The early communications from official sources described the cascade events in language that was precise enough to be technically accurate but framed in ways that implied the situation was being managed. The language of officials in the first days of the Ark crisis was the language of people who believed that the normal tools of human problem solving would eventually solve this, because the normal tools of human problem solving had always eventually solved things before. That belief was not unreasonable. It was also wrong. Children in the affected areas of the first cascade events were particularly vulnerable, not because the Ark specifically targeted them, but because the support systems that protected children in ordinary life, schools, medical care, food distribution, safe shelter, were among the first things to collapse. The documentation of what happened to children in the first Ark-affected areas is sparse because record-keeping was not the priority in those circumstances. But there are fragments, notes passed between adults trying to coordinate protection, supplies lists that mention small shoes and vitamins. These details are a particular kind of difficult to encounter in the law because they make absolutely concrete what the statistics only gesture toward. The underground bunker systems that would eventually house the survivors of the Ark crisis were not designed for rapid mass deployment. They were designed for slower-moving threats, for scenarios where there would be time for orderly relocation. The speed and geographic spread of the cascade events meant that many people who might theoretically have reached a bunker entrance did not. The distance was too great. The communication infrastructure that would have directed people to the nearest entrance was down. The transportation infrastructure that would have moved people quickly was disrupted. The bunkers saved the people who were close enough to them, or who had prior knowledge of their locations, or who were part of the administrative and military structures that had predetermined access. They saved a fraction of those who might have been saved under better circumstances. One detail in the law of the first cascade period that rewards close attention is the behaviour of animals. Domesticated animals, dogs and cats, and the various animals that had lived alongside humans responded to the Ark with behaviour that their owners found deeply distressing. Not the distress that animals show during thunderstorms, but something closer to the behaviour that animals show when they encounter a predator. A fundamental biological alarm. Dogs that were otherwise calm became uncontrollable. Cats disappeared into hiding and would not emerge. Birds that had been habituated to urban environments flew away and did not return. Whatever the animals sensed in the Ark, their nervous systems classified it as something fundamentally threatening in a way that went beyond their experience of ordinary danger. The social dynamics within the affected cities in the first days of the Cascade crisis followed patterns that emergency researchers had documented in previous disasters, but at a speed that previous disasters had not required. The formation of mutual aid groups, the identification of informal leaders, the development of rationing systems, the mapping of physical threats, the negotiation of shelter. These social adaptations happened quickly because human beings are very good at rapid social reorganization under threat. The tragedy of the first Cascade period was not that people failed to adapt socially, it was that the pace of infrastructure collapse outran even the rapid human capacity for social adaptation. Before the social structures could stabilize, the conditions they were stabilizing for had changed again. The first attempts to capture or study Ark units were made within days of the first Cascade events. Small units that had been disabled by conventional weapons were retrieved by research teams who recognized, early, that understanding these machines was essential to any effective response. The initial findings from these early studies are referenced in the law, though the details are fragmentary. What they found, apparently, was a level of engineering sophistication that was simultaneously recognizable and deeply strange. The components were made of materials that existed in human manufacturing, but the architecture of the systems, the way the components were arranged and interfaced, did not match any design lineage that could be identified in human engineering records. Communication between affected cities in the early Cascade period happened through improvised means when the primary infrastructure was down. Radio, analog radio, using pre-digital frequencies, proved more resilient than digital communication in the early chaos. People with knowledge of radio technology became very quickly important people. The information they carried between isolated communities was often fragmentary and sometimes wrong, but it was better than nothing. And the development of a loose radio network in the early crisis period was one of the more remarkable instances of human resilience that the law documents. Some of those radio operators were still transmitting months later, maintaining connections between isolated groups who would otherwise have had no knowledge of each other's existence. The governments that survived the first cascade events did so primarily by moving their decision-making capacity underground and by radically simplifying their organizational structures. The complex bureaucracies of the pre-fall world did not function well under the conditions of the early arc crisis. What worked was smaller, flatter, more responsive command structures that could make decisions quickly and implement them without the multi-layer approval processes that normal governance required. The transition from normal governance to crisis governance was painful. It involved the abandonment of many processes that had existed for good reasons and the concentration of authority in the hands of fewer people than was comfortable. But it was what survived. Military doctrine in the first cascade period was essentially being written in real time. The traditional frameworks of warfare were not applicable. Conventional air power was effective against individual arc units, but not against cascade events at scale. Ground forces could engage arc units successfully, but were overwhelmed by the numbers that cascade events deployed. The doctrine that eventually emerged of targeted harassment, strategic infrastructure protection, and managed withdrawal from areas that could not be held was not the doctrine that any military had trained for. It was improvised under fire at enormous cost by people who were simultaneously losing and learning. The question of who was responsible, in the political sense, for the arc crisis was raised almost immediately and has never been fully answered. Governments that had managed the orbital infrastructure looked at the evidence that the arc came from orbital installations and faced uncomfortable questions about their role in creating the conditions for what happened. The accusations and denials of that early period are preserved in the law in fragmentary form, and they make for difficult reading, not because they reveal clear culpability, but because they reveal the degree to which human political instinct, the search for someone to blame, the protection of institutional reputation, the management of public perception, continued to function even in the midst of catastrophe. The experience of surviving the first days of a cascade event is documented in several survivor testimonies that the Ark Raiders lore preserves. They share certain features: the initial disbelief, the moment when disbelief becomes untenable, the decision to move, regardless of having a plan, the encounter with other people who are also moving, also without a plan, and the improvised coordination that emerged from that encounter. The first night in a location that was not home, surrounded by people who were not family, managing fear and exhaustion, and the persistent uncertainty about what came next. These testimonies are the human texture of the Ark fall, and they are preserved in the lore with a care that suggests whoever assembled these records understood their importance. By the end of the first month of major cascade events, the world had changed in ways that were already irreversible. The cities that had been hit were not going to be rebuilt anytime soon. The orbital infrastructure that had been part of the global economy for a generation was disrupted or destroyed. The communication networks were fragmented. The political structures that had governed the world were in various states of dissolution, adaptation, or desperate continuation. The people who had been moved into bunkers were beginning to understand that the bunker was not a temporary shelter, but a new home. And in the ruins above them, the Ark continued their work, moving through the infrastructure of the fallen world with the patience of machines that did not need to eat or sleep or mourn. The temperature changes in cascade-affected cities in the aftermath are something that survivors described in unexpected detail. Without the heat generated by millions of people moving through heated spaces, without the residual warmth of power systems and machinery, the large urban environments of the post-cascade world became significantly colder at night than they had ever been during the era of human occupation. Cities that had always been heat islands, trapping and radiating the warmth generated by dense human activity, began to breathe cold air through their empty streets. Survivors who sheltered in those early post-cascade urban zones before reaching underground facilities described the cold as having a specific quality different from the cold of the countryside, and that difference is something that stayed with them. There is a specific class of survivor accounts from the first cascade period that the law preserves under various informal headings, and these accounts all involve the experience of watching arc units work from a position of concealment, people who hid in elevated positions or in structures that arc units were not currently targeting, and who watched from windows or from ruins as the machines below them dismantled the city. These accounts are not tactical, they are observational. They describe the quality of arc movement in language that is not always the language of threat assessment, but sometimes, and this is something the law seems aware of and does not try to smooth over, the language of watching something that is, in purely aesthetic terms, remarkable. The efficiency, the coordination, the way the machines relate to their environment and to each other. Survivors who had time to observe in safety rather than fleeing describe the experience as one that they have spent years trying to understand their own response to. The children who survived the first cascade events and made it underground were, by the accounts of the adults who were with them, often more functional than the adults in the immediate term. Children have less invested in the previous world. They respond to immediate conditions with an immediacy that adults, who are simultaneously processing the loss of everything they understood as normal, cannot always match. This observation was made with mixed feelings by the adults who recorded it. The resilience of children, their capacity to adapt to new conditions with something resembling equanimity, is both admirable and, in these circumstances, heartbreaking. The children who adapted quickly to the underground were adapting to the end of the world with the neuroplasticity that evolution gave them for exactly this kind of adaptive task. That they needed to use it is the thing that the adults found it hard to sit with. The specific geography of the early cascade events seems, in retrospect, to follow a logic that was not obvious at the time. The first cities hit were not the largest cities in the world. They were not the political capitals of the major states. They were, as analysis of the early cascade record suggests, the cities with the highest density of a specific kind of infrastructure. Large-scale power generation and distribution, combined with high-density communication relay systems, combined with significant automated manufacturing capacity. The ARC were not targeting human populations. They were targeting energy and information infrastructure. This pattern, once identified, allowed some useful predictions. Cities that were primarily political or cultural centres but lacked major power and communications, infrastructure, were not first-wave targets. That information saved lives in the communities where it was understood quickly enough. The first winter after the major cascade events was a significant threshold. Underground communities that had been operating on the assumption that the situation would be resolved, that the cascade events would stop and the surface would become reoccupied, faced the approaching cold with a new clarity about the nature of their situation. Heating the underground was possible. Feeding the underground through winter was possible. But the management of expectations, the adjustment from temporary to indefinite, from emergency to new normal, from weeks to potentially years, was a social and psychological process of enormous difficulty that played out differently in different communities depending on their leadership, their resources, and the character of the people who had gone underground together. The first deaths in the underground communities, deaths from illness or injury rather than from arc activity, prompted a set of decisions about resource allocation and social organization that shaped the long-term structure of underground life. Who receives priority medical care? Who has access to the most protected sleeping areas? How food distribution is managed when the available supply is finite and the need is total. These questions, which in ordinary life are handled by complex social and economic systems, had to be answered directly and immediately in the early underground communities. The answers that were given in those early days were not always the answers that retrospective analysis would endorse, but they were given under extreme conditions by people doing their best, and the communities that survived are the ones whose early answers were at least functional enough to hold things together. The people who had specialized knowledge of underground systems, the engineers who maintained the pre-fall bunker infrastructure, the military personnel with training in confined space operations, the medical staff with experience in managing health in enclosed environments, became immediately essential in ways that required rapid social renegotiation of their status and authority. In the pre-fall world, these people had been professionals with specific skills. In the underground world, they were the difference between survival and its absence. The adjustment in social status was, for most of them, uncomfortable in a way that they managed with varying degrees of grace. Power that comes from necessity rather than from the normal processes of social negotiation is a different kind of power, and the people who held it in those first months understood, at some level, that they held it conditionally. The light at the end of the last tunnel sealed in the early cascade period, when the last surface access point was closed and locked, and the emergency seals engaged, is something that several accounts describe with the same image: darkness. Not the gradual darkness of nightfall, which carries its own familiar quality, the absolute darkness of a space that has been sealed from external light, a darkness without gradation or direction. The people who were in those corridors when the seals engaged described the darkness as something that lasted only seconds before the emergency lighting came on, but that in those seconds contained something that is difficult to name. The understanding, perhaps, that the world above was closed, that what had been was over, that what came next would be different in ways that could not yet be seen. Chapter 3. The Underground: How Humanity Survived. The bunker cities of Ark Raiders are in some ways the most carefully detailed aspect of the entire lore. More than the Ark themselves, more than the surface ruins, the underground is where the human story of this world is most fully realized. And that makes sense because the underground is where people have been living for long enough to develop a culture, a politics, a mythology, a set of shared references that distinguish them from both the world that was lost and the world that exists on the surface. The underground is not a temporary situation. For most of the people living in it, it is simply where they live. The physical structure of the bunker cities varies considerably between locations, but the lore gives us a clear enough picture of their common elements to build a general understanding. Most of the major bunker cities were built around pre-existing underground infrastructure: transit tunnels, utility corridors, emergency shelter systems, and in some cases deliberately constructed deep facilities that predated the Ark crisis by decades. These foundations were extended, reinforced, and adapted in the years after the first cascade events, as it became clear that the underground was not a temporary refuge but a permanent habitat. The engineering required for this adaptation was considerable, and the traces of that engineering are visible in the layered architecture of every major bunker city. Air is the first challenge of underground living, and the law treats it seriously. The air management systems of the bunker cities are enormous, complex, and absolutely critical. They involve filtration systems that remove the contamination that has built up in the surface atmosphere, ventilation systems that manage air circulation through tunnel networks that were not originally designed for habitation, and monitoring systems that track air quality continuously. The people who maintain these systems occupy a particular place in underground society. Their work is invisible when it is successful and immediately catastrophic when it fails. The cultural weight placed on the air managers and the social respect accorded to them is one of the details that makes the bunker city societies feel real. Food production in the bunker cities involves a combination of approaches, most of them visible in the law as environmental details. Vertical growing systems using artificial light, fungiculture, the cultivation of mushrooms, which requires no light at all and can use waste organic material as substrate. Insect protein farming, which is deeply unpopular culturally but extremely efficient nutritionally. Algae cultivation in sealed water systems. And a small amount of surface foraging by raiders who bring back what they can. None of these individually would be sufficient. Together, they sustain the underground populations at a level that is nutritionally adequate, but gastronomically very limited. The food of the underground is one of the persistent sources of psychological difficulty for the people who live there, not because it is dangerous, but because it is relentlessly monotonous. Water in the bunker cities is managed with an intensity that the surface world never required. Every drop is tracked. Every recycling system is maintained to its maximum efficiency. The geological context of each bunker city matters significantly. Some have access to aquifers that can be safely tapped, while others depend almost entirely on closed-loop recycling systems. The water managers of the bunker cities have a status similar to the air managers, respected, trusted, and somewhat set apart. There is a particular cultural anxiety around water that pervades underground society in arc raiders, visible in the way water is used in social rituals, in the expressions people use, in the specific weight given to water-related obligations. In a world where water could run out, the social importance of water management runs very deep. Power is the third critical resource, and its management defines much of the underground social order. The power systems of the bunker cities draw on whatever sources their specific geography makes available. Geothermal in some locations, stored chemical energy from surface raids in others, small modular reactors in the most sophisticated facilities. The power available determines what can be run. More power means better air and water management, more effective food production, better lighting, and more computing capacity. Less power means rationing, which means hierarchy, which means conflict over who gets priority. The politics of power distribution are among the most contentious in underground society, and the law preserves records of these conflicts in ways that make clear they are ongoing. Light deserves its own discussion because its psychological importance in the underground is difficult to overstate. Human beings evolved in a world with natural light cycles, and the absence of natural light in the deep underground has measurable psychological effects. The bunker cities address this through artificial lighting systems designed to approximate natural light cycles with variable color temperature and intensity that mimics dawn, daylight, and dusk. These systems are maintained carefully because the psychological effects of disrupted light cycles, sleep problems, mood disorders, reduced cognitive function are significant enough to affect the productivity and social cohesion of the community. There are people in the underground who have never in their lives seen natural light, and the stories they tell about the surface are like stories about a foreign country. The governance structures of the bunker cities are one of the most interesting aspects of the underground civilization, and the law provides enough detail to build a reasonably clear picture. The immediate post-cascade bunker populations were governed by whoever had authority at the time of descent, which meant military commanders, government officials, and facility managers. Over time, these initial structures evolved in response to the specific conditions of underground life. What emerged in most of the major bunker cities is a form of technocratic governance with social overlay, meaning that technical competence in critical areas is the primary source of authority, but this authority is checked by social structures, community councils, elected oversight bodies that represent the broader population. The social stratification of the underground is not primarily based on the same categories that governed pre-fall society. Wealth, in the traditional sense, is not meaningful in an environment where most critical resources are collectively managed. Occupational hierarchy has largely replaced wealth hierarchy. What you do, and how important what you do is, determines your social position. This creates a society that is, in some ways, more meritocratic than the pre-fall world, and in other ways, deeply rigid, because occupational access is governed by training and mentorship networks that tend to reproduce themselves. The children of air managers tend to become air managers. The children of medical personnel tend to become medical personnel. The formal meritocracy operates within an informal hereditary structure. Children in the bunker cities grow up in an environment that is, by the standards of the pre-fall world, austere. They have less space, less variety, less exposure to the range of experience that a surface world provides. But the law suggests that childhood in the underground is not bleak in the way that the physical conditions might suggest. Communities that have nothing to spare for non-essential activities still find ways to make things for their children. Games, stories, art materials, improvised from whatever is available. The schools of the underground cover not just practical skills, but also something like cultural education, the history of the surface world, the arts and literature that survived in digital archives, the languages that the pre-fall world spoke. Children in the underground are not raised in ignorance of what was lost. They are raised in full knowledge of it, which creates its own particular kind of sadness. The relationship between the underground generations and the surface is not uniform. Among the older population, those who remember the surface, the relationship is one of grief. Among the middle generations, those who are told about the surface extensively but have no personal memory of it, the relationship is more complex, a mixture of cultural inheritance, inherited grief, and a sometimes resentful awareness that the world of the surface is constantly held up as something better than what they have. Among the youngest generations, those born underground with no familial connection to the surface in living memory, the relationship is often one of curiosity, and in some cases, a complete absence of the emotional weight that older generations carry. For these young people, the surface is not a lost home. It is an interesting and dangerous place. Raiders are the interface between the underground and the surface, and their role in underground society is complex. They are necessary. They bring back materials and technology and information that the underground could not otherwise access. They are also, by definition, people who go to the surface and come back, which means they carry knowledge of the surface that most underground citizens do not have. This knowledge gives them a particular kind of social power that is simultaneously respected and viewed with some suspicion. The underground cultures that have developed around raiding, the preparation rituals, the departure ceremonies, the welcome back practices, the memorialization of raiders who did not return, are among the richest cultural expressions in the bunker city world. Medicine in the underground has developed in ways that reflect the constraints of the environment and the specific health challenges of underground living. There are the physical health challenges, vitamin D deficiency, which is managed by supplementation and artificial light. Respiratory issues from air that is filtered but not identical to natural atmosphere. Musculoskeletal problems from environments that lack the natural, varied terrain that human bodies evolved to navigate. There are the psychological health challenges, claustrophobia, depression, anxiety disorders that express specifically in the underground context. The medical systems of the bunker cities have adapted to all of these, developing treatment protocols that draw on pre-fall medical knowledge but have been substantially modified for the underground context. Religion and spirituality in the underground have taken forms that might surprise an observer from the pre-fall world. The organized religions of the pre-fall world survived in various forms in the bunker populations, maintained by practitioners who brought their traditions underground with them. But new spiritual and quasi-spiritual practices also emerged, specific to the underground context. Some are focused on the surface, rituals that orient toward the world above, that maintain a spiritual connection to a world that cannot be physically accessed. Some are focused on the machinery, practices that treat the critical systems of the bunker as something more than mechanical, that incorporate the rhythms of air and water and power management into spiritual observance. These new practices are not always understood or accepted by the preservers of pre-fall religious traditions, and the resulting tensions are a persistent feature of underground cultural life. The concept of time in the underground has necessarily been reconstructed. Without the natural light cycles that human timekeeping evolved around, underground society maintains time through artificial means. The light cycles already mentioned, communal schedules, clock systems, but the relationship to larger time, to seasons, to years, to the longer rhythms that the surface world provided, is different. Underground communities mark the passage of years with ceremonies, but those ceremonies do not have the visceral, physical grounding that the natural year provides on the surface. Time in the underground is something that has to be actively maintained rather than something that the environment provides. This has subtle effects on the underground culture's relationship to history, memory, and expectation. The dead are managed in the underground in ways that the physical constraints of the environment dictate. Burial, in the traditional sense, is not possible in deep underground facilities. Cremation requires energy that might otherwise be directed toward critical systems. The solutions that the bunker communities have developed for managing their dead vary by community and by cultural heritage, but the most common approaches involve either chemical reduction or very deep placement in designated geological formations that are not part of the active habitat. The ceremonies surrounding death in the underground are, by universal account, among the most important and carefully maintained cultural practices. The dead are not abandoned, even when the logistics of managing them are difficult. Art in the underground exists at every level, from the small personal ornaments that people make in their off hours to the large-scale murals that cover the walls of communal spaces. The subject matter of underground art reflects the preoccupations of underground life, the surface which appears in idealized, remembered, or imagined forms. The arc which appears sometimes as threat, sometimes as abstraction, sometimes as a subject of genuine aesthetic fascination. The machines and systems of the underground itself, the air handlers and water recyclers and power systems that keep everyone alive, which underground artists have found ways to render as subjects of beauty, the people of the underground, and the children, always the children, who appear in underground art with a frequency that suggests they represent something larger than themselves. Memory is a particular preoccupation of underground culture. The people who remember the surface carry those memories with enormous weight, and the transmission of those memories to people who do not have them is taken seriously. There are formal oral history programs in several of the major bunker cities, in which people with surface memories record them systematically. These recordings are treated as culturally important objects. There are also informal transmissions, grandparents telling grandchildren about what rain felt like, parents describing the smell of a forest to children who have only ever known filtered air. These personal transmissions are not always accurate, and they are not always free of the distortions that grief and time produce. But they are sincere, and they are the primary mechanism through which the surface world remains real to people who have never seen it. The relationship between different bunker communities is complex, because the underground is not one unified civilization, but a collection of communities that are, to varying degrees, in communication and cooperation with each other. Physical connection between bunker cities through tunnel networks is possible in some cases and not in others. Communication between them through wire-based systems that are less vulnerable to arc interference than wireless communication has been established over time by raider teams that laid cable on the surface. Trade, which involves the physical movement of goods through raider supply chains, has created economic interdependence between communities that have different resource profiles. None of this has produced a unified underground government. It has produced a patchwork of bilateral and multilateral relationships, maintained by custom, necessity, and the occasional explicit agreement. The law suggests that there are bunker communities that have gone dark, communities that at one point were in communication with others, but that have stopped responding. The reasons for this are, in most cases, unknown. It could be infrastructure failure. It could be a decision to maintain isolation. It could be something worse. The underground communities that are aware of the dark communities treat them with a particular mixture of anxiety and practical concern. Anxiety because the silence suggests something has gone wrong. Practical concern because the resources and population of a dark community represents significant value if they are still intact. Several raider operations have been mounted specifically to make contact with dark communities. Not all of them returned with answers. The children born underground to parents who were themselves born underground represent a generational threshold that the law marks as significant. These are people who have no family memory of the surface at all. Their grandparents' stories of rain and open sky are as distant, experientially, as any other historical account. They are not people who have lost the surface. They are people for whom the surface is a concept rather than a memory, a goal rather than a grief. The difference in orientation is subtle but real, and the older generations notice it without always knowing how to feel about it. There is something of both hope and sorrow in watching a generation grow up for whom the tragedy of the Ark fall is history rather than lived experience. The economic systems of the underground communities are not markets in the traditional sense, because the scarcity that drives market behavior is managed collectively rather than distributed through price signals. Most critical goods, air, water, food, power, are treated as commons and managed by the community structures responsible for each. Non-critical goods and services, the things that constitute quality of life beyond bare survival, operate in systems that more closely resemble informal reciprocal exchange or soft barter. The concept of individual wealth accumulation is not absent from underground society, but it is constrained by the structural reality that the most important things cannot be individually owned. What people can accumulate is reputation, skill, and social connection, and these are the real currencies of the underground. Language changes in the underground communities over generations. The languages brought down from the surface are maintained because the archives and the cultural preservation programs actively work to maintain them. But the underground has also developed its own vocabulary, specific terms for the conditions and concerns of underground life that did not exist in surface language and for which surface vocabulary does not have exact equivalents. These new terms are not formalized in any way. They emerge from use, spread through social contact, and eventually become part of the everyday vocabulary of communities that use them. Linguists in the underground archives who study the evolution of language under these conditions regard the emergence of underground-specific vocabulary as one of the clearest markers of a genuinely distinct underground culture that is not simply the pre-fall culture preserved in a smaller space. The violence of the underground communities is not the same as the violence of the pre-fall world. The conditions of scarcity and confinement and constant low-level stress create conditions that are not historically associated with low rates of interpersonal conflict. The communities that have managed this best are the ones that developed clear, consistently enforced social norms early in their history, and that invested in the social infrastructure for conflict resolution. The communities that have managed it worst are the ones where resource competition became openly adversarial, where factional divisions hardened, or where the governance structures lost the trust of a significant portion of the population. The law documents both outcomes. The difference between a bunker community that is genuinely functioning and one that has descended into internal conflict is not always immediately visible from outside, and raiders who visit unfamiliar communities sometimes discover that the reality is significantly darker than the reports they were given. The relationship between underground communities and the surface changes over time, as more is known about the surface, and as the skills required for surface operation are more widely distributed. In the early post-cascade period, the surface was a place of absolute danger and mystery. Over generations, it became more known. The patterns of arc activity were charted, the safe zones were identified, the transit routes between underground access points were established. The surface became, in the sense relevant to experienced raiders, a navigable environment rather than an incomprehensible one. This does not mean it became safe. It means it became known, and known danger is different from unknown danger in ways that matter for how people relate to it. The shift from the surface as pure terror to the surface as dangerous but familiar is one of the long-term cultural transitions that the law traces with some care. The tools of underground culture are not the tools of the pre-fall world, even when they physically are. A pre-fall entertainment device used in an underground community is not the same object it was before, because the context of its use is entirely different. The content accessible on it is a finite archive rather than an expanding live feed. The act of watching a pre-fall film in the underground is an act of cultural archaeology as much as an act of entertainment. Watching something made by people who did not know what was coming, in a world that no longer exists, with the full knowledge of everything that happened between then and now. The emotional layering of this experience is considerable, and the underground communities have developed their own norms for navigating it. Some people find pre-fall entertainment comforting, others find it unbearable. Most people's relationship to it changes over the course of their lives. The particular quality of underground community that is perhaps most consistently described in the law is its intensity. In confined spaces with the same people over years and decades, relationships that in the surface world might have been casual acquaintances become something more defined by proximity. People who do not like each other must nevertheless cooperate for survival. People who do like each other develop bonds that the surface world, with its mobility and its infinite replacement options, rarely produces at this depth. The friendships of the underground are, in survivor and second-generation accounts, described as among the most significant relationships of their lives. The enmities are described similarly. The closeness of underground life compresses everything, the good and the bad, into a density that has no surface equivalent. The sounds of the underground are something that people who have grown up in it rarely consciously notice, but that visitors from one community to another register immediately. Every underground community has its own sonic signature, the specific frequency of its air management systems, the rhythm of its water recycling infrastructure, the ambient sounds of its daily activity patterns. These sounds are the background noise of underground life in the same way that traffic and bird song and weather are the background noise of surface life. They are what quiet sounds like in the underground, and they are what people who grew up underground miss if they spend time on the surface, in the same way that surface people miss the sky. Not a specific sound, but the particular quality of sound that says you are home. The teaching of history in the underground communities is one of the most politically charged activities that takes place there. What is taught about the pre-fall world? What is taught about the cascade events? What is taught about the role of specific institutions and specific decisions in producing the current situation? All of these questions are contested because the communities that now occupy the underground are descended from the communities that made the decisions of the pre-fall world, and the implications of those decisions for questions of responsibility and guilt are not comfortable for the living descendants of the people who made them. The history taught in different underground communities varies significantly, and raiders who spend time in multiple communities sometimes find the contrast disorienting. The same events presented with entirely different emphases, different conclusions, different moral frameworks. The physical health of underground populations is carefully monitored and extensively documented in the underground archives, because the medical community understood early that the long-term effects of underground living on human physiology were not fully known, and that building a longitudinal health record was essential. What that record shows, across the generations of underground habitation, is a mixed picture. Some predicted health problems have been successfully managed. Others have proven more persistent than anticipated. New health patterns have emerged that were not predicted at all, associated with specific aspects of underground life that pre-fall medicine had no category for. The physical health of underground communities is generally adequate by the standard of keeping people functional and productive. It is not excellent by the standard of what pre-fall medicine could have provided. The gap between those two things is something that the medical community lives with daily. The architecture of the underground communities reflects the compromises of their origin and development. The initial spaces, converted from pre-fall infrastructure, have shapes that were designed for purposes other than human habitation. Transit tunnels with their curved walls and tracked floors, utility corridors with their pipes and conduits running along every surface, emergency facilities with their Spartan functionality. These have been adapted, decorated, partitioned, and personalized over years and decades by the people who live in them, until the original function of the spaces is often barely visible beneath the layers of habitation. The aesthetic of the underground is, in the communities that have had the time and resources to develop one, an aesthetic of transformation, visible evidence of the process by which inhospitable space was made into home. The night cycle of the underground, the dimming of the lighting systems that approximates the onset of dark, is the daily punctuation of underground life. The social significance of this transition is considerable. The activities that happen in the underground night, the quieter, more private activities, the conversations that happen when the ambient community activity has reduced, are culturally distinguished from the day activities in ways that have developed organically over the generations of underground habitation. The underground night is not the absolute darkness of a sealed space. It is a managed approximation of night that people have learned to use and to value in ways that track the evolutionary human relationship with the dark, as a time for rest, for privacy, for the conversations that daylight makes harder. The maintenance of the underground community's physical infrastructure is a daily, continuous activity that involves a significant proportion of the population at any given time. The systems that sustain underground life are complex, interdependent, and subject to the ordinary failures of all mechanical systems. What makes underground maintenance different from surface maintenance is the consequence of failure. A damaged air handler is not an inconvenience, it is a potential mass casualty event. This elevates the social status of maintenance work in ways that surface societies rarely do, and it creates a culture of maintenance that treats the physical systems of the community with a combination of respect and anxiety that visitors from communities with different resource profiles sometimes find excessive. The maintenance culture of the underground is, however, the reason that communities that might have failed years ago have survived, and its practitioners are aware of this in the way that people who have prevented disasters tend to be, quietly, persistently, and with a watchfulness that never fully relaxes. The music of the underground communities is one of the most direct expressions of the underground's cultural development, because music, unlike many other art forms, can be produced with minimal resources. Voices, improvised instruments, percussion made from available materials. The music that has developed in the underground over the generations of habitation draws on the pre-fall traditions that were brought down by the founding populations, but it has evolved in response to the specific acoustic properties of underground spaces and the specific emotional needs of underground life. The underground has a music that does not sound like surface music. It fills different frequencies, it uses different structures, it carries different emotional content. Visitors from other communities who hear a community's music for the first time often describe the experience as unexpectedly moving. The music makes the community audible as a community. The concept of outside in the underground communities carries a weight that it does not carry in surface contexts. Outside means the surface, which is the domain of danger, of arc activity, of the ruined world. But outside also means other communities, other people, other ways of organizing life that the local community does not practice. The relationship between inside and outside, between us and them, is more sharply defined in underground communities than in most surface contexts, precisely because the physical boundary between inside and outside is absolute. You're either in the bunker or you're not. You are either of this community or you're a visitor. The clarity of the boundary has psychological and social consequences that the pre-fall world, with its permeable and multiple boundaries, did not produce. The food preservation knowledge that the underground communities have developed represents a significant body of practical expertise that exists nowhere in the pre-fall record. The preservation of food without reliable refrigeration, the maximization of nutrition from minimal organic inputs, the management of spoilage in environments where the temperature and humidity are controlled but not to food storage specifications. These are skills that the underground communities have developed over decades of necessity. The people who hold this knowledge are not scientists in the formal sense. They are practitioners who learned from practitioners, who learned from practitioners, a living chain of practical knowledge that is as critical to community survival as the air management systems, and that is considerably less documented in the official archives. Chapter 4. The Raiders, those who walk the surface. A raider is not simply a person who goes to the surface. The word suggests a certain kind of action, and the action is real enough, but it does not capture what raiding actually is, what it requires, what it takes from people, or what it gives them in return. Raiding is the most dangerous regular occupation in the underground world. It is also, for a significant number of people, the most necessary. The materials that come back from surface raids, the recovered technology, the salvaged components, the scavenged medical supplies, the data archived from pre-fall systems are essential to the functioning of the underground communities. Raiders are not optional. They are a load-bearing element of underground civilization. The selection of raiders is one of the more carefully considered processes in underground society, because the cost of losing them is high. Training requires resources. Experience is accumulated slowly and lost suddenly. The communities that depend on raiders cannot afford to produce them carelessly or deploy them without appropriate preparation. The result is that raiding teams are typically drawn from people who have demonstrated specific qualities, physical capability, obviously, but also psychological resilience, spatial reasoning, technical aptitude, and what underground communities tend to describe with an untranslatable expression that means something like comfortable with not knowing. The last quality is perhaps the most important, The surface is not a controlled environment. Nothing about it can be fully predicted. A raider who cannot function without certainty will not function on the surface. Training for raiding involves both technical and physical components. The technical training covers ARC unit recognition and classification, which matters because different ARC unit types present different threat levels and require different responses. It covers the operation of salvage equipment, which has evolved considerably since the early days of raiding, and now includes specialized tools for extracting components from ARC-targeted installations without triggering the attention of nearby ARC units. It covers basic field medicine, because raiders operate too far from medical facilities for anything more than basic care to be available. It covers communication protocols, both for maintaining contact with the underground during a raid and for communicating with other raider teams that might be operating in adjacent areas. Physical training is extensive but not primarily oriented toward combat. Fighting ARC units is not the goal of raiding. Avoiding them is. The physical training of raiders is oriented toward endurance, load-bearing, and the specific motor skills required for operating in ruined environments, climbing through debris, moving through compromised structures, crossing terrain that has been disrupted by ARC activity. The ability to move quietly is practiced and valued above almost any other physical skill. A raider who can move through an area without making sound that ARC sensors might detect live significantly longer than one who cannot. The gear that raiders carry is the product of years of iterative development, informed by what works and what does not under real surface conditions. The environmental suit that protects against the surface atmosphere is the most important piece of equipment, and its maintenance is treated as an absolute priority. A compromised suit is not a slight hazard, it is a mission-ending and potentially life-ending situation. The weapons that raiders carry are designed for rapid response against ARC units rather than sustained engagement, things that disable rather than destroy, because destruction of ARC units tends to attract more ARC units, while disabling a unit and leaving it in place often does not trigger the same response. The communication equipment is compact, low power, and designed to use frequencies that ARC sensors are less likely to flag. The psychology of a raider is something that the ARC Raiders lore addresses with more depth than might be expected. It is not a simple psychology. It involves holding simultaneously the knowledge of the danger and the ability to function despite that knowledge, which requires a particular kind of mental discipline that not everyone can maintain. It involves the management of what raiders describe as the weight, a term for the accumulated awareness of close calls, of the deaths of colleagues, of the constant presence of threat. Some raiders manage this weight by maintaining strict boundaries between their surface identity and their underground identity. Others manage it by sharing it, by talking about what they experienced on the surface with people who understand. Others manage it poorly, and the law does not shy away from showing what that looks like. The social dynamics of raider teams are intense in ways that non-raiders sometimes find difficult to understand. People who have relied on each other in life-threatening situations develop bonds that are not easily replicated in other contexts. Raider teams function as primary social units in ways that can sometimes be more important than family or community ties. The trust required to operate effectively as a team in ARC territory is not casual. It is built over time through shared experience, through small demonstrations of reliability, through the accumulated evidence that each member of the team will do what is required when it matters. Breaking that trust or failing the team in a critical moment carries a social weight in raider culture that is difficult to recover from. The deaths of raiders are handled by underground communities with a particular set of practices that have developed specifically around the fact that raider deaths often happen in places where the body cannot be recovered. This creates a category of death that is in some ways the hardest to process, not confirmed, not visible, not marked by the physical reality of a body. The missing raider. The raider who went out and did not come back, and whose fate may never be known. The rituals that have developed around this category of loss are among the most culturally significant in raider communities, ceremonies that mark the transition from missing to mourned, that acknowledge both the hope and the grief that the ambiguity contains. Surface navigation is a skill that can be learned but cannot be fully systematized. The Ark Raider's lore makes clear that the surface is not a static environment. Ark activity changes it. Structural collapses happen. New hazards emerge. The knowledge that a raider carries about a specific area of the surface has a shelf life, and operating on outdated knowledge of a surface zone can be as dangerous as operating with no knowledge at all. Experienced raiders develop an intuitive reading of surface conditions that goes beyond the specific information they have been given, a sense of what a particular sound means, of what a specific configuration of arc activity suggests about what is happening elsewhere in the zone, of when to continue and when to stop. What raiders bring back from the surface matters enormously to the underground communities they serve. The most valuable items are functional technology that can be integrated into underground systems. Power components, communication hardware, medical equipment, processing systems. These have direct and immediate value. Also valuable are data storage devices that might contain pre-fall information, technical documentation, cultural records, anything from the before time that can be added to the archives the underground communities maintain. Less glamorous but equally important are bulk material salvages, metals, polymers, ceramics, things that can be recycled into components, tools, structures. The underground runs on what the surface gives up. There is a category of raider experience that is difficult to fit into any practical or economic framework, and that is the experience of being on the surface and simply being there. Looking at what was, standing in a space that was once inhabited by people going about their ordinary lives. Finding the small objects of pre-fall life, a child's toy, a personal photograph, a collection of books, and feeling the specific weight of those objects in context. Raiders are not primarily archaeologists, but they encounter archaeological material constantly, and the effect of that material on them varies widely. Some raiders become inured to it, some raiders never do. Some raiders are the reason that certain recovered objects end up carefully preserved in underground archives rather than stripped of any usable material. The surface itself, the physical environment that raiders move through, is a complex and evolving ecosystem. The buildings of the pre-fall cities are in various stages of structural deterioration, depending on when they were hit and how thoroughly. Arc activity continues to change the landscape. New configurations of arc units appear in places that were previously clear. The natural world has begun to reclaim some areas that are no longer actively worked by arc units, with vegetation returning and animals moving through spaces that were once entirely human in character. This ecological reclamation is, on one level, hopeful. On another level, it is evidence of how thoroughly and finally human civilization has been removed from the surface. Arc unit behavior on the surface follows patterns that experienced raiders learn to read. There are activity cycles, periods of more intense arc movement, and periods of less. There are zones of persistent high arc activity and zones that appear to be deliberately avoided. The reasons for these patterns are not fully understood, and the law presents them as operational observations rather than explained phenomena. What experienced raiders know is that the patterns exist and can be used. A zone that sees heavy arc activity in the morning may be relatively quiet by afternoon. A route that passes through an arc-avoided zone may be significantly safer than a more direct route through an active zone. This kind of operational knowledge is the most valuable thing a raider can carry, and it is passed on through mentorship with great care. The first time on the surface is a formative experience for every raider, and the law describes it in ways that suggest it is consistently more intense than training prepares anyone for. The scale of the ruins. The quality of the light, which is real and direct and nothing like the artificial light of the underground. The smell, which is a mix of atmospheric contamination, organic decay, and the specific metallic quality that associates with arc activity. The sound, which is both more and less than people expect. More because the surface has ambient sounds that the underground simply does not. Less because the populated noise of a functioning city has been replaced by wind and distant mechanical sounds. First-timers describe a moment, usually early in the first surface excursion, when the reality of what happened simply lands. When the abstract knowledge of the collapse becomes a physical, visceral understanding. The economics of raiding are more complex than a simple supply and demand framework captures. Raiders do not work purely for material compensation, because the underground economies of the communities they serve do not primarily run on personal accumulation. They work within systems that involve community obligation, reputation, and a variety of non-material compensations. The status that comes with raider experience is real and significant. The access to certain community spaces, certain social opportunities, certain forms of recognition that comes with demonstrated raider service constitutes a form of compensation that pre-fall economic frameworks would not have recognized, but that functions effectively within the underground social context. There are raiders who specialize, salvage specialists who focus on specific types of technology, intel specialists who prioritize the recovery of information over material goods, route specialists who focus on establishing and maintaining safe transit paths between underground communities, medical specialists who combine raider skills with medical expertise, either to provide medical support to raider teams or to recover specific medical materials and equipment. The specialization of raiders reflects the increasing complexity and organization of raider culture over the generations, from early era raiding that was essentially improvised survival to the current era, in which raiding is a profession with its own internal hierarchy, its own technical standards, and its own body of knowledge. Some raiders go out and do not come back because they chose not to. This is a thing that the law acknowledges with a certain careful silence. People who disappeared on the surface and were mourned as lost who were, in some cases, not lost at all but gone, making a life on the surface or trying to. There are fragments that suggest the existence of surface communities, small groups of people who decided that the underground was not for them and who are finding ways to exist in the ruins. The underground communities generally do not advertise the existence of these surface dwellers, because the implications are complicated. If people can survive on the surface voluntarily, the calculus around the underground changes in ways that underground governance would prefer not to have widely discussed. The relationship between veteran raiders and new raiders is mentorship in the most direct sense of the word. You learn from the person who knows, by going with them and watching and doing and being corrected when you get something wrong. There is no theoretical substitute for this because the surface is not a theoretical environment. No amount of briefing and simulation fully prepares a raider for the real thing. The veteran who brings a new raider out for the first time takes on a specific responsibility. To the trainee, obviously, but also to the community that needs that trainee to eventually become reliable. The relationship between mentor and new raider often becomes one of the most important relationships in a raider's life. It is the relationship through which you learned to survive. The specific fear that raiders feel on the surface is not the same fear that people feel in other dangerous situations, and experienced raiders talk about this difference in ways that suggest it has been carefully considered. The fear of arc activity is not the fear of a known threat with known parameters. It is the fear of something whose full capabilities are not understood, whose patterns of behavior can be learned but not perfectly predicted, whose response to specific stimuli does not always follow the expected pattern. This particular quality of fear, the fear of something that is dangerous and partly known but not fully knowable, has a psychological texture that is different from the fear of a well-characterized threat. Some raiders describe adapting to it over time. Others describe never adapting, of maintaining a high alert state throughout every surface operation that is physiologically and psychologically expensive, but that, they believe, keeps them alive. Night operations on the surface are relatively rare because the added difficulty of navigating in darkness in an environment that is already dangerous makes the risk-benefit calculation unfavorable in most circumstances. The darkness of a surface night, without the light pollution that the pre-fall world cities generated, is much more complete than any pre-fall urban environment would have produced. The sky above a night surface operation carries more stars than most underground people, who have never seen a night sky without light pollution, can easily imagine. There are accounts of raiders making surface runs at night who were stopped in their tracks by this particular visual, the completely unpolluted night sky. Some of them describe it as the most beautiful thing they have ever seen. The disconnect between that beauty and the danger of the environment in which it appeared is something that raiders who experienced it return to repeatedly. The physical costs of raiding accumulate in ways that the communities supporting raiders have to manage. The suits that protect raiders from the surface atmosphere are effective but not perfect, and the cumulative exposure to surface conditions over a career of raiding has physiological consequences that are well documented in the underground medical records. There are the structural physical costs, the injuries from operating in ruined environments, the falls, the cuts, the strain, injuries from carrying heavy loads over difficult terrain. There are the exposure costs, the residual effects of atmospheric and possibly arc emission exposure that manifest over time in ways that medical monitoring tracks but cannot always prevent. A long-career raider is not a physically unmarked person. The surface writes itself on the body of anyone who spends significant time in it. The question of what raiders are for, in the deepest sense, is one that the law circles around without fully landing. The practical answer is obvious. They recover the resources that underground communities need to survive. But there is another answer that is present in the cultural record, in the way raider culture talks about itself, in the significance that underground communities invest in raider departure and return ceremonies. Raiders are the people who maintain the connection between the underground world and the surface world. They are the ones who do not allow the underground to become fully sealed, physically and psychologically, against the world above. They are the ones who go up and come back down and carry with them the knowledge that the surface is still there, still real, still accessible to someone. In a world where the underground could very easily become the whole world, that service is not small. The archive materials recovered by intel specialist raiders have shaped the intellectual culture of the underground communities in ways that are not always fully acknowledged. The knowledge of pre-fall science, engineering, and culture that lives in the underground archives is not a static collection. It is added to regularly, as new data recovery devices are found, and their contents archived. Some of the most important intellectual developments in the underground communities of the post-Cascade era have been driven by the discovery of specific pre-fall records that change the understanding of some critical, technical, or historical question. Raiders who specialize in data recovery are, in a real sense, the suppliers of the intellectual raw material from which underground culture continues to develop. The gear modifications that raiders make to their standard issue equipment over the course of their careers are a visible record of their operational experience. The modifications that persist, that are adopted by other members of the same team, or copied by newer raiders, become part of the evolving standard of raider equipment design. The modifications that do not persist, that were individual solutions to individual problems, remain as personal customizations that identify a specific raider to anyone who knows what they are looking at. A veteran raider's gear is, in this sense, a biography of sorts, a visible record of the problems they encountered and the solutions they devised, written in modified components and added attachments and replaced parts. The equipment of dead raiders is studied carefully before being recycled or passed on. The communities of origin that raiders come from mark them in ways that become visible over time. A raider who grew up in a community with a strong engineering tradition approaches problems differently than a raider who grew up in a community with a strong medical tradition. A raider from a community that lost many people to ARC activity early in its history carries a different relationship to risk than a raider from a community whose founding population had a relatively secure experience in the early post-cascade period. These differences are not absolute. Training and experience modify them substantially, but they are present, and experienced raider team leaders think about them when composing teams. Because a team whose members bring different perspectives to surface problems is more robust than one whose members all approach things the same way. The relationship between raiders and the ARC units they encounter on the surface is not adversarial in any simple sense. Most surface operations are specifically designed to avoid direct encounters. Raiders who find themselves in proximity to ARC units are not, in most cases, trying to engage them. They are trying to be somewhere else, as efficiently as possible. The encounters that do happen, that cannot be avoided, or that result from situations going wrong, are the encounters that generate the most instructive operational knowledge. A raider who has survived multiple direct ARC encounters and has processed those encounters analytically is among the most valuable resources in any underground community's operational knowledge base, because their experience carries information about ARC behavior that observation and study alone cannot fully replicate. The departure ritual for a raider team leaving on a surface operation varies by community, but its function is consistent. It marks the transition from the protected space of the underground to the dangerous space of the surface, and it does so in a way that both the departing raiders and the community remaining behind can participate in. The most common elements are a shared acknowledgement of the risk, a formal statement of the operation's purpose, and some form of community blessing or good wish expression. These rituals are not purely symbolic. They serve the practical function of ensuring that both the departing team and the community have a clear, shared understanding of the purpose of the operation and the expected duration of absence. When a team does not return within the expected window, the departure record becomes part of the context for the decisions that follow. The injuries that raiders sustain in the course of operations and the medical care they receive upon return are one of the most concrete measures of the cost of raiding as an activity. The underground medical records that track raider injuries over time show a pattern that reflects the evolution of raider technique and equipment. Early-era raiding produced injury patterns that reflect improvised methods and inadequate equipment, while current-era raiding produces injury patterns that reflect the accumulated improvements of decades. The injury rate has decreased over time, but it has not approached zero, and it will not approach zero as long as the surface remains ARC active. Raiding at any level of sophistication involves accepting a probability of injury that no amount of preparation can reduce to negligible. The archive of raider operational reports that the major underground communities maintain is one of the most practically valuable bodies of documentation in the underground world. These reports, standardized in format but highly variable in content, cover the routes taken, the hazards encountered, the ARC activity observed, the materials recovered, and the operational incidents of every recorded surface operation. Reading them in sequence over the years of accumulated record is like reading a slow-motion survey of the surface world. The changes in ARC activity patterns, the progression of structural deterioration in specific areas, the emergence of new vegetation in zones that ARC units have ceased to work. The gradual accumulation of operational knowledge that makes current raiding more effective than early raiding. These records are not exciting to read. They are the most honest and detailed account of the post-cascade surface world that exists. The bond between a raider and their home community is complex and sometimes strained. Raiders carry knowledge of the surface that most underground citizens do not have, and this knowledge creates a kind of double vision, the ability to see both the underground world and the surface world with some clarity, and the consequent difficulty of entirely belonging to either. The underground can feel, after sufficient time on the surface, both more precious and more claustrophobic than before. The surface can feel, after returning to the underground, both more vivid and more threatening than the operational reports convey. Raiders navigate between these two experiences and the communities that contain them with varying degrees of success. The ones who navigate it best tend to be the ones who have developed a strong sense of what they are working toward that is not purely about the next operation, but about the larger purpose of their work. The question of what the surface will eventually look like, if and when the Ark situation changes in a way that makes extended surface habitation possible, is one that raider culture thinks about, in ways that the underground communities at large do not. Raiders have seen the surface. They know what is actually there. Not the idealized surface of underground cultural memory, but the actual current surface, with its ruins and its Ark activity, and its gradually returning ecology. The vision of the surface future that raiders carry is more specific and more grounded than the surface future imagined by people who have never seen it, and this sometimes puts them at odds with the reclamation movement's rhetoric, which tends toward a vision of the surface that is more idealized than current surface conditions support. The most experienced raiders, the ones who have spent the most time on the surface over the longest careers, are among the most psychologically complex people in the underground world. They have seen things that most people have not. They have survived situations that most people would not. They have built their identities around a set of skills and experiences that are specific to a context that very few people share. The communities around them often project onto them a kind of heroism that the veterans themselves tend to find uncomfortable, not because they are falsely modest about the difficulty of what they do, but because the heroic narrative misses something essential about what the experience actually is. The surface is not a place that produces heroes, in the narrative sense. It is a place that produces people who are very good at surviving it. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. Chapter 5. The Ark. Themselves, anatomy of an invasion. Understanding what the Ark actually are is the central mystery of the entire Ark Raiders lore. And it is a mystery that the lore does not resolve. This is deliberate. The Ark Raiders world is built around the presence of something that is comprehensible in its behaviour while remaining deeply opaque in its nature. You can observe what the Ark do. You can catalogue their forms. You can identify their patterns of behaviour. You cannot, with anything like certainty, say what they are, where they ultimately come from, or what they want in any final sense. What follows is the most coherent account I can build from the available evidence, and I will try to be clear throughout about what is observed fact within the lore and what is interpretation. The Ark come in a range of physical forms, and cataloguing these forms has been one of the primary activities of the research facilities in the major underground cities. The smallest Ark units are roughly analogous in scale to large insects or small animals. They are fast, highly maneuverable, and capable of moving through spaces that larger units cannot access. Their primary apparent function is reconnaissance and precision disassembly of small components. They are the units most likely to go undetected in a facility until they have already done significant damage, because their individual footprint, both physical and in terms of the sensor signatures they produce, is small. Raiders who have encountered swarms of these small units describe the experience as distinctly different from encountering larger arc units, less dangerous in any individual physical sense, but profoundly disorienting in a way that is hard to articulate. Medium-scale arc units are the most commonly encountered by raider teams and the most thoroughly documented in the available lore. These units range from roughly human scale to several times larger, and they exhibit a behavioral range that is wider than the smaller units. They can be observed apparently patrolling. They can be observed apparently coordinating with other units of similar scale. They engage with their environment in ways that suggest something beyond simple programmatic response. They adjust their behavior based on what is around them. They respond to changes in their environment in ways that are not always immediately predictable from the behavior patterns that have been documented, and they occasionally behave in ways that have no obvious instrumental explanation. The large arc units, which the raider culture has assigned various informal names depending on the specific configuration, are relatively rare but profoundly significant when present. A large arc unit in a zone changes the operational calculus entirely. Their sensory range is wider. Their response capability is greater. Their capacity for what might be called tactical adaptation, responding to raider presence in ways that suggest an understanding of raider behavior and an ability to adjust to it, is more pronounced than in smaller units. Large arc units appear to occupy a particular position in whatever organizational structure the arc maintain. They are not simply bigger versions of smaller units. Their behavior suggests a different function, possibly something like coordination across a wider operational area. The sensory systems of arc units are documented in fragments, but never fully explained. What is known is that the arc do not rely primarily on visual detection, or rather, they do not rely solely on visual detection in ways that the human visual spectrum explains. Radar protocols around arc detection are based on a much broader array of concealment than simply staying out of sight. Sound, electromagnetic signature, thermal output, vibration, chemical trace, all of these appear to contribute to arc detection capability in ways that vary between unit types. Part of what makes surface operations genuinely dangerous is that the full parameters of arc detection are not known and may not be knowable with current research capacity. Arc behavior patterns suggest a degree of coordination between units that exceeds what simple programmatic communication would produce. When one arc unit encounters a radar team, other arc units in the area frequently respond in ways that suggest they have received relevant information, moving to positions that cut off likely escape routes, adjusting their patrol patterns to cover areas that the initially responding unit is no longer covering, arriving in configurations that suggest they were directed rather than individually deciding to converge. The nature of this coordination is a significant, open question in the lore. Is it communication in any meaningful sense? Is it a shared environmental response to common stimuli? The available evidence does not settle the question. The Ark's apparent focus on infrastructure rather than biological life is one of their most studied behavioral characteristics, and it is also one of the most troubling in its implications. The Ark systematically dismantle human-made technology. They do not appear to care about the natural world. They do not hunt animals. They do not target geological features. They are interested, with a consistency that looks like intent, in the products of human technological civilization. This has led to the obvious question, what do they do with what they dismantle? The material that the Ark strip from human infrastructure does not accumulate on the surface in visible ways. It goes somewhere. The most widely held theory is that it is being processed and incorporated into Ark production processes. The Ark appear to maintain something like territory. There are areas of the surface that are consistently, heavily populated by Ark units, and these areas show characteristics that distinguish them from the areas around them. The infrastructure destruction in these zones is more complete. The arc unit activity is more varied, suggesting the presence of multiple function types rather than just active operational units. These high-density arc zones appear to have been established gradually, expanding over time rather than being fixed from the beginning of the cascade. They suggest that the arc are not simply moving through the surface environment, but are, in some sense, establishing themselves within it. The question of arc intelligence is the one that the law circles most carefully. The behavior of arc units is consistent with sophisticated programmatic execution, complex goals, multi-step plans, adaptation to environmental conditions. It is also consistent with something more. The boundary between extremely sophisticated automation and something that deserves to be called intelligent is genuinely unclear in philosophy and engineering, and the Arc Raiders law does not try to resolve it. What it does is present the evidence and let the reader sit with the ambiguity. The researchers in the underground facilities who have studied arc units most closely are, the law suggests, people who do not speak confidently about this question. The ones who speak most confidently about arc intelligence tend to be the ones who have spent the least time studying them. Arc units that are captured and studied present particular research challenges. A functioning arc unit that has been contained will attempt to disable or circumvent its containment with a persistence that researchers find remarkable. This is not the behavior of a simple automaton following an escape routine. It is adaptive. It varies. It tries different approaches. It appears to learn from what works and what does not, adjusting its attempts based on accumulated experience with the specific containment system. Researchers who have spent extended time with contained arc units describe a quality to this behavior that they find difficult to name, something that sits between mechanical persistence and something that has to be called purpose. Contained arc units have been observed to do something that has no obvious instrumental explanation. They appear to attend to their environment in ways that do not serve any obvious goal. A contained unit that is apparently determined that escape is not currently possible will sometimes go still and seem to observe the space around it. Not in a monitoring way, in the sense of surveying for threats or opportunities, in a way that is harder to characterize. Researchers who have observed this behavior with sufficient frequency to have accumulated impressions of it describe it, cautiously and with appropriate professional hedging, as seeming like something that attends to experience for reasons other than immediate utility. The variety within arc unit types suggests a design process rather than an evolutionary one. Each type is optimized for a specific function in ways that organic evolution, with its constraints and trade-offs and path dependencies, does not produce. The small reconnaissance units are almost perfectly designed for their role. The large structural units are almost perfectly designed for theirs. The medium operational units occupy a middle ground that suggests intentional design for versatility rather than optimization for a single function. The overall system, as far as it can be reconstructed from the available units, is not the work of a random process. It is the work of something that knew what it was making. The materials from which arc units are constructed are partially human in origin and partially not. This is one of the more carefully documented findings in the Arc Raiders law, and it points toward conclusions that are uncomfortable for several reasons. Human manufactured materials, alloys, polymers, processed metals appear in arc unit construction. This means that the material stripping that the arc perform on human infrastructure is not simply destruction, it is collection. The arc are taking human-made materials and using them to build themselves. Whether this has always been the case, whether the pre-cascade arc were already constructed from harvested materials, or whether the material harvesting is a more recent behavior, is not clear. The non-human materials in arc unit construction have been analyzed extensively by the research facilities that have access to the appropriate equipment, and the findings are not reassuring. The non-human materials are not exotic in their chemical composition. They are made of elements that exist in ordinary matter. But the structural organization of these materials is not anything that human engineering has produced or can currently replicate. The precision at the molecular scale is far beyond current human manufacturing capacity. Whatever produced these materials had access to fabrication methods that are not in any human engineering lineage. This is perhaps the single most direct evidence that the arc are not human-made. Arc units do not appear to experience damage the way living organisms do. Damage to a component does not necessarily result in behavioral change proportional to the extent of the damage. A unit can lose a significant portion of its mass and continue operating, redistributing function to remaining components in ways that suggest the control architecture is not localized in any specific part of the unit. The redundancy built into arc units is extensive. Disabling one requires either destroying a sufficient proportion of the unit that no functional core remains, or targeting specific components that are critical to the particular unit type, and that are in most cases not externally visible. The knowledge of where to hit an arc unit to disable it effectively is among the most practically valuable technical knowledge that raiders carry. There is something in the arc raiders' lore that can only be called behavior pointing toward memory. Units that have been previously encountered by raider teams sometimes respond to those teams differently than units encountering humans for the first time. The response is not simply more aggressive. It is more informed, tactical approaches that seem to account for what the unit learned in the previous encounter. Whether this is individual memory, shared through the coordination network between units, or something else entirely, is unknown. But the practical consequence for raiders is significant. An area where arc units have previously had contact with a raider team is not the same as an area they have not. The units there have learned something. The arc units that appear to have been operating for the longest continuous period since the first cascade events are, when they can be identified, among the most studied objects in the underground research community. These long-running units show modifications over time, changes to their configuration that do not appear to be the result of repair. They look more like the result of incremental self-modification. The implications of this are significant. It suggests that arc units are not simply maintained, but that they actively improve themselves, and that improvement is driven by accumulated operational experience. A unit that has been operating on the surface for years is not the same unit it was when it first arrived, even if it has never been near an arc manufacturing process. The specific behaviors associated with arc unit types in different operational contexts are documented in the underground operational records with enough consistency to allow reasonably reliable predictions. But the record also contains exceptions, instances where unit behavior diverged from the established pattern in ways that did not have obvious explanations. These anomalies are collected and studied by the research community with particular interest because they may represent the edges of arc capability, the places where the behavior of arc units exceeds what the understood model predicts. The anomalies are rare. Their rarity does not make them unimportant. An anomaly that appears once is data. An anomaly that appears twice is a pattern beginning to emerge. The relationship between different arc unit types, whether they operate under any kind of hierarchical command structure, or whether each unit type is independently programmed for its specific function, is one of the most practically important and most difficult questions in arc research. The evidence is ambiguous. Some observations suggest independent operation. Unit types appear to function without any obvious direction from other unit types. Other observations suggest coordination, the simultaneous and apparently synchronized response of multiple unit types to a common trigger, in patterns that would be difficult to explain without some form of coordination signal. What that signal is and where it originates remains unknown. The smallest arc units, the ones operating at insect scale or smaller, are the least studied and possibly the most dangerous category in terms of their potential for undetected infiltration of underground facilities. The detection systems that the underground communities use for surface monitoring are calibrated primarily for medium and large arc unit signatures. The signatures of the smallest units are at or below the detection threshold of current systems in many configurations. The question of whether small arc units have ever penetrated underground facilities is not one that any underground community's official communications address directly. The unofficial communications, the conversations that happen between engineers and security personnel, suggest that this question is taken seriously and that the answer may not be the reassuring one. Arc units observed in zones where there is no current human activity show behavioral patterns that differ from units in zones where human or radar presence has been recent. In the absence of recent human signals, arc units in a zone show what might be called maintenance behavior, systematic survey patterns, interaction with the infrastructure they have dismantled or installed, and what appears to be a lower level of active alertness. Whether this lower alertness represents reduced processing capacity directed toward the maintenance functions, or whether it represents something that could be characterized as rest is a question that the available evidence cannot resolve. The distinction matters more for the philosophical question of what the arc are than for the practical question of how to operate around them, but both questions are worth asking. The sound of an arc unit in operation has been recorded and analyzed extensively, and the analysis reveals that arc units produce sounds in frequency ranges that extend well below and above the range audible to unaided human hearing. The ultrasonic and infrasonic components of arc unit operational sound appear to serve communication functions, and the patterns within these components have been studied by researchers attempting to decode whatever information the sounds carry. Progress has been limited, not because the patterns are simple, but because they are complex enough that the analytical tools available to underground researchers have not been adequate to the task. What the researchers have established is that the patterns exist, that they vary in ways that correlate with observable differences in arc unit behavior, and that understanding them would be one of the most significant advances available to anyone trying to understand the arc more deeply. The question of what arc units do with time, if that concept applies to them at all, is one that produces more careful language from underground researchers than almost any other aspect of arc study. The units that are not currently active in any obvious instrumental sense, not maintaining infrastructure, not engaging with detected stimuli, not in apparent transit between locations, these units are doing something. What that something is, what process is running in a stationary arc unit, whose external behavior does not suggest obvious function, is not determinable from external observation alone. The researchers who study this most carefully say, with the precision of people who are aware of the implications of their language choices, that they cannot rule out that something experiential is taking place. That is as far as they will go. It is further than most people expect them to go. The arc's relationship to each other, to other units rather than to human infrastructure or human beings, is one of the least studied aspects of their behavior, largely because the study of arc-to-arc interaction requires sustained observation of arc activity in zones where researchers are not present, which limits the data that can be collected. What can be inferred from the operational data that radars gather is that arc units, in proximity to each other, show behavioral coordination that exceeds what would result from independent reaction to the same environmental stimuli. There is something happening between arc units when they are in proximity to each other that affects the behavior of each unit in ways that cannot be fully explained by each unit's individual programming, responding to the same inputs. What that something is, whether it constitutes communication or something more intimate than communication, is not known. The end of an arc unit, when it is finally disabled or destroyed, has been observed and studied in ways that have produced one consistently surprising finding. The moment of final functional failure in an ARC unit is not accompanied by what researchers expected: a gradual shutdown of systems in decreasing order of priority, the behavior of a programmatic system reaching the end of its operational capacity. What is observed is something more like collapse, a rapid, simultaneous cessation of multiple systems that does not follow the pattern of graceful degradation. Some researchers describe this as analogous to death rather than shutdown, while being very careful to note that this is a metaphor and not a claim about the nature of what ended. Others prefer to note only the observable fact that the end of an ARC unit is abrupt, simultaneous, and complete, and that the units that remain nearby show behavioral changes after witnessing it that suggest the event registers in some way that does not apply to the destruction of ordinary machinery. Chapter 6. The Factions and Their Secrets. The underground world is not politically unified, and the factions that have developed within and around the bunker cities represent some of the most genuinely complex elements of the ARC Raiders' social landscape. These are not factions in a cartoonishly adversarial sense. Most of them share the basic goal of human survival. What they differ on, with deep and sometimes irreconcilable conviction, is how that survival should be organized, what its ultimate aim should be, and what relationship humanity should have with the ARC and the surface world. Understanding the factions requires understanding that their differences are rooted in genuine uncertainty about the right answer, not simply in selfishness or ideology for its own sake. The largest and most institutionally stable faction in the underground world is what the law most often refers to as the administration, the governing body that descended from the emergency authorities of the early post-cascade period and has maintained with varying degrees of success the organizational structures of the major bunker cities. The administration is not a single entity, it is a loose federation of governance structures that share certain protocols, certain information sharing agreements, and a broad common goal of maintaining the underground communities as functioning, sustainable habitats. Within that broad common goal, there is enormous variety. Some administration-aligned communities are relatively open. Others are more centralized, with authority concentrated in technical experts who do not broadly share their decision-making. The research faction is smaller than the administration, but disproportionately influential because of its control of technical knowledge. The researchers who study the ARC, who analyze recovered technology, who maintain the engineering and scientific infrastructure of the underground, occupy a position of significant social power because what they know is essential and not easily replicated. Research culture in the underground has developed its own internal politics, its own competitions and alliances, its own debates about methodology and priority. The most contentious of these internal debates is the debate about what the goal of ARC research should be. Some researchers believe the goal should be ARC elimination, understanding the ARC well enough to destroy them. Others believe the goal should be ARC understanding, and that understanding might eventually lead to something other than continued conflict. A third significant faction, less formally organized than the administration or the research community, but no less real for that, is what might be called the reclamation movement. People whose primary goal is the return to the surface. Not temporary raiding, not cautious exploration, permanent reclamation of surface territory. The return to sunlight and open sky. The reclamation movement is ideological in the sense that it is organized around a vision of human life that is fundamentally different from the current underground reality. Reclamationists believe that the underground is a transitional state, not a final destination, and that acting as though it is permanent is itself a kind of defeat. The fourth major faction in the ARC Raiders lore might be described as the pragmatists. These are people, and communities who have largely stopped asking questions about the broader situation and are focused almost entirely on day-to-day survival and quality of life within the constraints that exist. Not because they are intellectually incurious, but because the questions about the arc and the surface and the long-term future of humanity are, from their perspective, questions that individuals and communities cannot meaningfully affect. What they can affect is the immediate quality of life in their own community. Whether the air is good, whether the food is adequate, whether the children are growing up with enough stimulation. These are the questions that the pragmatists prioritize, and in a world of limited resources, their argument has genuine force. There are smaller factions as well, communities that have developed unusual beliefs about the ark, some of which would be described by other underground communities as cults, though the practitioners would contest that label. Groups that have organized around specific technical capabilities and use those capabilities as a kind of social currency. Raider communities that operate largely independently of the major bunker cities, making decisions based primarily on their own assessment of surface conditions. Former military units that have maintained something like military structure, even in the absence of a functioning military command above them. The political landscape of the underground world is not simple, and the Ark Raiders lore does not pretend that it is. The relationships between factions are complicated by the fact that individual people are rarely cleanly affiliated with a single faction. Most people in the underground world have multiple, sometimes conflicting, allegiances. A person might be employed by an administration-affiliated facility while being personally committed to the reclamation movement. A researcher might be institutionally affiliated with a research council while privately believing that Ark research is misguided. Raider teams often include members with widely divergent political views who have put those views aside for the practical necessities of the work. The real political landscape of the underground is made of individuals negotiating between competing loyalties, not armies arrayed against each other. The secrets that factions keep from each other are among the most interesting narrative threads in the Ark Raiders lore. The administration maintains a significant amount of information that is not shared with the general population, in some cases for reasons that are genuinely protective, and in others for reasons that are more clearly about power maintenance. The research faction has findings that are not publicly released, sometimes because they are genuinely uncertain and would cause unnecessary alarm, sometimes because releasing them would change the political balance in ways that the research establishment does not want. The reclamation movement has contacts and networks on the surface that they have not disclosed to the administration, because the administration would not approve of what those contacts and networks are doing. One secret that the lore suggests is known to a small number of people at the highest levels of the major underground governing bodies is information about the orbital structures that the Ark appear to maintain or inhabit. Whatever was built in high orbit in the years before the cascade, it still exists. Orbital observations conducted with the limited instruments available to underground communities confirm that there is still significant structural mass in certain orbital positions. The nature and function of those structures is not determined, but their existence is known to at least some people, and the information is being held carefully, shared only within networks that have demonstrated the capacity to handle it without acting in ways that would be harmful. The tension between factions around the question of Ark origin is one of the most intellectually interesting aspects of the underground political landscape. There are people who believe, with a confidence that others find alarming, that the Ark are human-made, or at least human-triggered, that something humanity built or did in the pre-Cascade period created or activated the Ark, and that the responsibility for the collapse of civilization lies with specific human actors. There are people who believe with equal confidence that the Ark are entirely external, alien in the most complete sense, And there are people who believe the truth is more complicated than either of these positions, and that the complication is precisely what certain powerful parties have an interest in preventing from being widely understood. The raider organizations, by which the law means the various groups that organize surface operations, occupy a particular political position because they control the most important interface between the underground and the surface. An administration that depends on raiders for critical supplies is not fully in control of its own infrastructure. Raiders who understand this leverage range from those who use it responsibly to those who use it for organizational advantage. The tension between the administration's desire to control raider operations and the raiders' structural independence is a persistent feature of underground politics, and it has produced a variety of negotiated arrangements that satisfy neither party fully but function well enough to maintain. The medical community occupies its own quasi-factional position, distinct from but overlapping with both the administration and the research faction. The doctors and medical technicians of the underground communities have authority that is, in practical terms, difficult to challenge. They are the people who stand between the population and preventable death, and this gives them a form of power that is very hard to remove. The medical community is generally aligned with the administration in terms of institutional affiliation, but its internal culture emphasizes a set of values: the prioritization of individual patient welfare, the management of community health data as a commons rather than an asset, that sometimes put it in conflict with both the administration and the research faction. The children of factional leaders present an interesting case study in the reproduction of underground political culture. In a world where social mobility is constrained by the occupational structures of underground life, the children of influential people in each faction tend to remain in proximity to that faction's concerns, educated in its values and trained in its skills. The result is that factional affiliations in the underground world are not purely ideological choices made by adults in possession of full information. They are also inheritances passed down through family and community in the same way that language and food culture are passed down. The person who grows up the child of a reclamation movement family does not simply believe in surface return. They feel it as part of who they are. The language of factional politics in the underground is worth noting because it reveals a great deal about the underlying values of each group. The administration tends to speak in the language of management and sustainability, of systems and long-term viability. The research community tends to speak in the language of knowledge and evidence, of what can be demonstrated and what remains uncertain. The reclamation movement tends to speak in the language of identity and inheritance, of what was taken and what can be recovered. The pragmatists tend to speak in the language of the immediate and the concrete, of what is in front of them and what can actually be done today. These languages are not just rhetorical styles. They reflect genuinely different ways of understanding what the underground world is and what it is for. The historical grievances between factions are real and persistent. The decisions made in the early post-cascade period about who was brought underground and who was not, about what resources were allocated to which communities, about which facilities were designated as primary shelters and which were considered secondary, left behind inequities that have not been resolved in the decades since. Communities that received less in the early period are in most cases still less resourced than communities that received more. The people who made those early decisions were not, for the most part, deliberately creating the inequities that resulted. They were making triage decisions under extreme pressure, but the results were what they were, and the political resonance of those results is still felt. The factional conflicts that have turned violent in the underground world are documented in the archives, and they are a sobering read. The conditions of underground life, the confinement, the scarcity, the absence of the many outlets, that surface life provides for the management of social tension make the escalation from political disagreement to physical conflict more likely than it was in the pre-fall world. The communities that have avoided internal violence are generally the ones that invested early and consistently in conflict resolution mechanisms, in systems for airing grievances before they become crises, and in cultural norms that treat internal violence as a collective failure rather than an individual one. These investments are not glamorous. They do not produce visible achievements in the way that engineering advances or successful raids do, but the communities that made them are still coherent, and some of the ones that did not are not. The external face of factional politics, the way that each faction presents itself to other factions during negotiations and joint operations, is distinct from the internal face, the way that each faction discusses its own situation and its competitors within its own community. Raiders who travel between communities regularly are uniquely positioned to observe this distinction, and the most observant among them develop a sophisticated sense of the gap between what each faction says it is and what it actually is. This gap reading is not cynicism exactly. It is the political sophistication of people who have seen enough different versions of the underground political situation to understand that no single faction's self-presentation is the whole truth of what it is. The future that each faction is working toward is not fully compatible with the futures that the others are working toward, and this incompatibility is the source of the most significant long-term tensions in the underground world. A future in which the administration has successfully stabilized the underground as a permanent civilization is not the same future as one in which the reclamation movement has successfully established surface habitation. A future in which the research community has achieved a comprehensive understanding of the Ark is not necessarily a future in which the Ark have been eliminated or contained. The question of what kind of future is actually possible, given the constraints of the current situation, is one that each faction answers differently. And the difference in answers is the difference in what each faction does with the resources and time available to it. The informal economy that exists between factions, the exchange of favours, information, access, and protection that does not appear in any official record, is in some ways as important as the formal economic and political relationships between them. Underground communities that are officially competitors for resources regularly engage in informal cooperation around specific shared interests. Raider organizations that are officially independent of all major factions maintain relationships with all of them that involve obligations and expectations that are not publicly acknowledged. The research faction shares findings with specific administration leadership before releasing them officially, and receives in return a degree of operational latitude that the official relationship does not provide for. The underground world runs, in significant part, on these informal agreements, and the people who understand and navigate them most skillfully are the ones who hold the most real power. The spiritual and philosophical dimensions of factional identity are not trivial. The underground world has had decades to develop its own intellectual and spiritual culture, and the factions have each been shaped by, and have in turn shaped that culture in ways that go beyond purely practical concerns. The reclamation movement, for example, has developed a set of ideas about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, and about the specific harm of being cut off from it, that extends well beyond the practical argument for surface habitation. The research faction has developed a philosophical commitment to understanding overaction that is not merely a methodological preference, but a genuine worldview. These deeper dimensions of factional identity are what make them durable, because they give people reasons to maintain their affiliation that are not purely instrumental. The moments when factions cooperate are as revealing as the moments when they conflict. There are specific types of challenge that require cross-factional response, a significant new cascade event that threatens surface operations, a medical emergency that exceeds the capacity of a single community, the discovery of a major pre-fall archive that contains information relevant to multiple factional interests. In these moments, the practical need for cooperation forces the temporary suppression of factional differences, and what emerges is a kind of underground community that is more unified and more capable than any single faction alone. These moments of forced cooperation have occasionally produced lasting changes in the relationships between factions, usually in the direction of greater coordination. The question of whether such coordination can be made durable, whether the experience of crisis cooperation can be institutionalized in a way that persists when the crisis is over, is one that the underground governance community has never fully answered. The new generations entering factional politics in the current era are, in several communities, showing patterns that differ from those of their predecessors. The youngest adults currently active in underground governance and advocacy grew up in the fully stabilized underground, without the direct experience of the early post-cascade crisis that shaped the founders of each faction. Their relationship to the factions they are affiliated with is, in some cases, more skeptical and more pragmatic than that of the founding generation. They are less attached to the specific grievances and specific victories of the early underground period, and more focused on the current situation and the actual available options. Whether this generational shift will produce meaningful change in the factional landscape, or whether the structural incentives that maintain the current factional divisions will reproduce them in the next generation, is one of the genuine open questions of the underground world's current political moment. The question of what happens to the factions if the ARC situation changes significantly is one that underground political thinkers are beginning to address more directly than before. Each faction's identity and purpose is, to varying degrees, dependent on the current situation. The administration's legitimacy depends in part on the ongoing necessity of centralized management of underground resources. The research faction's primacy depends on the ongoing importance of ARC research. The reclamation movement's urgency depends on the ongoing inaccessibility of the surface. If the situation changes, the factions will change with it, and the political landscape of a world where the surface becomes accessible again, or where ARC behavior shifts significantly, or where a major new understanding of the ARC is achieved, will not look like the current landscape. What it will look like is something that different factions imagine very differently, and something that each faction is, in its own way,